Chapter 27 of Women's Suffrage and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Women's Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Shuler. Chapter 27. The Opposition Grows Grimmer. No observer accustomed to judge popular opinion could have failed to recognize by March 1920 that the 50 years' war for women's suffrage was won, and that no opposition could now do more than delay the final triumph. That women would vote was already an accepted fact. Suffragists from all parts of the country reported this acceptance. Yet the directors of the campaign knew that although the war for women's suffrage was won, the fighting would go on, and that, in all probability, the bitterest conflict of the half-century was scheduled for somewhere between the close of the last National Suffrage Convention and the proclamation of the Federal Suffrage Amendment by the Federal Secretary of State. It will be recalled that mention has been made of the fact that during the Chicago Convention, 4 state legislatures ratified, those of New Jersey, Idaho, Arizona, and New Mexico. One of these, New Jersey, served to emphasize for suffragists the mounting intensity of the opposition. In August 1919, Mr. James Nugent, the Democratic boss in the state, had declared himself a candidate for the New Jersey governorship and was quite frank in giving his reasons for doing so. He said, quote, "The only reason that I got into this campaign as a candidate for the gubernatorial honors was that the state needed at least one man with the courage to stand foursquare against prohibition and woman's suffrage." End quote. He was defeated at the primaries, September 23, 1919. The bosses of both political parties were avowedly anti-suffragists and with the liquor interests worked openly against the amendment. To cooperate with the National Suffrage Association's New Jersey auxiliary, a men's suffrage council was organized which contained the names of leading Democrats and Republicans. They united in the demand for political recognition of women. Everett Colby was chairman, and the honorary chairmen were Governor-elect Edward I. Edwards, United States Senators Joseph S. Frelinghuysen, and Walter E. Edge. The list of vice-chairmen included legislators, judges, and other public officials, editors, lawyers, business, and professional men from both major political parties and from all parts of the state. When the legislature convened in 1920, the resolution for ratification was the first measure introduced. A public hearing was held February 2nd, and the Senate ratified that same day. The opposition then concentrated its efforts upon the Assembly. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer had written to all the Democratic members urging support. By the evening of February 9th, when ratification was to be voted on in the Assembly, it was clear that the stage was set by the opposition for an all-night filibuster. Hugh Barrett of Essex, Nugent's special representative, led the opposition by making one motion after another, which, one by one, after hot fight and much talking, were defeated. Outside in the corridor was Nugent himself, constantly sending messages to his representatives. Suffragists were there too, helping to steady their friends and firm in the determination to get the vote that night. For 5 hours the filibuster went on without abatement. Then the opposition gave up the fight, and the resolution was passed. In Idaho and Arizona, both full suffrage states, there was no delay in ratification once the special session was called. Governor D.W. Davis called the legislature of Idaho February 11th. The call requested the legislators not to take the full amount to which they were entitled, but to confine the appropriation to an amount equivalent to their actual expenses only. The call further stipulated that no legislation should be considered other than ratification. The session came at the time of the meeting of the Republican State Committee and that of the Executive Committee of the Idaho Republican Press. Dr. Emma F. A. Drake, the only woman member of the House, introduced the resolution. The action there was unanimous, but in the Senate there were 6 opposing votes, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Governor Campbell of Arizona, though not enthusiastic over calling a special session, because the majority in House and Senate were Democrats while he was a Republican, had on August 1919 at Flagstaff promised the envoys sent out by the National Suffrage Association that he would call one if the women would poll the legislature in order to learn if it would ratify, and if the men would waive their per diem. He suggested the first week in November 1919, but it was 4 months later, at noon, February 12, 1920, when the first special session of the 4th State Legislature of Arizona ratified. Attached to the House bill were the names of the 4 women members, Mrs. Nellie Haywood, Mrs. Rosa Mackay, Mrs. Westover, and Mrs. O'Neill. There was little eloquence, but much dispatch, and the resolution went promptly to the Senate, which adopted the ratifying resolution at 9:15 p.m. In New Mexico, owing to the large Mexican population, there was doubt from the first whether the amendment could be ratified. Governor C.A. Lazarola was opposed to ratification, but as a Republican agreed to support it. In the legislature, the Democrats had worked for ratification, and a poll of their members, taken immediately in both houses, showed 20 out of 26 in favor. At the Governor's Conference in Salt Lake City the year before, the envoys of the National American Woman Suffrage Association had been assured by Governor Lazarola that although he was not for the federal suffrage amendment, Republican support would be forthcoming and the amendment would be ratified. It so happened that a Soldiers and Sailors Act, passed by the governor's insistence at the last session, was faultily drawn, and a special session was necessary to reenact the measure. The legislature met in special session February 16, 1920. There was a determined effort on the part of one member, Dan Padillo of Albuquerque, to submit a referendum on the amendment to the voters of the state. Immediately, the entire city protested. Suffragists, prohibitionists, YWCA, and many men's organizations, until Padillo declared that he would vote for immediate ratification, which he did. The 5 no votes in the Senate and 8 of the 10 opposed in the House were Republicans. The 33rd ratification followed 1 week later. It was that of Oklahoma. At the Governor's Conference at Salt Lake City in August 1919, J.B.A. Robertson, Governor of Oklahoma, gave the great expense and the fear of untimely legislation as his reasons for not calling a special session of the Oklahoma legislature. But he pledged that if the women could get the legislators to waive their per diem, he would call the session at once. He added, however, "I do not think it can be done, as the women do not care enough." Thereafter, he gave a telling exhibition of a chief executive dodging women who cared enough. In September, Miss Aloysius Larch Miller, Secretary of the Oklahoma Ratification Committee, assisted by a representative of the National Suffrage Association, secured signed pledges from a majority of the legislators that they would attend, serve without pay, consider no other legislation, and vote for ratification. When these were presented, the governor's answer was a refusal to answer. Several weeks later, he addressed the State Federation of Women's Clubs at Edmond and again offered the same excuses: expense and state political problems. Meantime, the Republican State Organization, through the Republican National Committeeman, James A. McGraw, had offered to pay the expenses of the Republican legislators who could not pay their own. The governor answered that by saying that the states which did not have the suffrage should assume the burden of ratifying the suffrage amendment. In January 1920, the Democratic State Central Committee called county conventions to select delegates to the Democratic State Convention. Many of these county conventions passed resolutions asking the governor to call the session. Although she had been confined to her room for several days with influenza, Miss Larch Miller attended the convention of her county, Pottawatomie, and spoke for the resolution in opposition to Attorney General S.P. Freeling, one of the ablest orators of the state, and also the strongest opponent of women's suffrage in Oklahoma. Her enthusiasm and eloquence carried the day for suffrage. The resolution was adopted. For her, the price was her life. The exertion proved too heavy a tax, and in 2 days she paid the supreme sacrifice for the cause she had served. Interviewed again, the governor said his action would depend on the action of his party convention. In the meantime, Senator Robert L. Owen, who had a long record for women's suffrage, had become a candidate for Vice President of the United States. Democratic women from many states had wired him to know why his state had not taken action on the federal suffrage amendment, reminding him that he was the only candidate for vice president whose state had not ratified. At the Democratic State Convention at Muskogee, February 5th, Governor Robertson finally agreed that because of his interest in the candidacy of Senator Owen, he would call the session. This he did for February 23rd. A majority of the legislators were pledged to ratify. The governor sent a favorable message, and there was a telegram from President Wilson to the Speaker of the House. Quote, "May I not take the liberty of expressing my earnest hope that Oklahoma will join the other suffrage states in ratifying the federal suffrage amendment, thus demonstrating anew its sense of justice and retaining its place as a leader in democracy." Unquote. In opposition was the activity of Attorney General Freeling, who used the states' rights argument to influence some members, but the sacrifice of Miss Larch Miller, coupled with the fact that Oklahoma was a suffrage state, overwhelmed all opposition. The resolution to ratify was passed February 27, 1920. Then Attorney General Freeling added one more chapter to his record against suffrage by immediately starting the circulation of a petition to refer this action to the voters. The decision of the United States Supreme Court that there could be no referenda on federal amendments ended this effort. Governor John W. Cornwell of West Virginia, a Democrat, was known to favor ratification. A letter from the National Suffrage Association in December 1919 brought word from him that as soon as there was a court decision on the public utilities question, which was to be voted upon with the suffrage amendment, the call would be issued. The Democratic governor called his Republican legislature in special session Friday, February 27, 1920. President Wilson wired members of the Senate as follows, quote, "May I not urge upon you the importance to the whole country of the prompt ratification of the suffrage amendment, and express the hope that you will find it possible to lend your aid to this end." End quote. The Democratic and Republican national committees urged ratification. The state's delegation in Congress used its influence, and the governor's message was in favor. The outlook was promising when opposition broke from two unexpected sources due to the contest over the governorship and to influences from outside the state. The Maryland legislature sent a committee to urge rejection of the amendment. They arrived February 28th. Senator George Arnold Frick and Representatives Willis R. Jones and Daniel P. Joseph, who said they had come to say that, quote, "West Virginia had no right to help put something over what was not wanted by other states," end quote. Two other members, Ellis R. Grimes and Senator Charles H. Gibson, came independently as former West Virginians to say that the entire legislature of Maryland was not opposed to ratification and that they believed, quote, "West Virginia capable of settling her own affairs without interference from Maryland," end quote. A vote was rushed through both houses and stood House ayes 46, nays 41. Senate ayes 14, nays 14. A motion to reconsider in the Senate was lost on Wednesday by the same vote. In the meantime, Senator Jesse A. Block, who was in California, received tardy notice of the session, wired that he was in favor of ratification, and asked for a pair. This was refused by the opposition with jeers. Secretary of State Houston G. Young immediately got into telephone communication with Senator Block, and he agreed to make the race across the continent if suffrage members would hold the lines intact until his arrival. The situation was acute. A motion in the House to reconsider had been laid on the table and could be called up at any time. Many legislators wanted to go home, and it was difficult to keep the necessary number of suffrage men on hand to defeat hostile attacks. The entire country watched and waited. The tie in the Senate held, and Senator Block sped across the country. The day he reached Chicago, the opposition resorted to its most desperate expedient by producing a former senator, A.R. Montgomery, who about 8 months before had resigned because he was leaving the state permanently. The governor had accepted his resignation, and he was living in Illinois. Arriving in Charleston, he demanded the return of his letter of resignation from the governor, who refused it because of documentary evidence that Mr. Montgomery had given up his residence in West Virginia. But Mr. Montgomery appeared in the Senate that afternoon and attempted to vote. President Cinso ruled that he was not a member. On an appeal from the ruling, the vote was a tie, and his case was referred to the Committee on Privileges and Elections. That committee sustained the president's ruling. Upon his arrival in Chicago, Senator Block was met by Mr. V. L. Highland, National Republican Committeeman from West Virginia, and Captain Victor Heinz, in charge of the National Republican headquarters in Chicago. He was given the choice of completing his journey by airplane or by train. Senator Block chose the airplane. Mrs. Block chose the train. They came by train. The trip was made with a record-breaking speed, and the senator arrived on March 10th, taking his seat in the Senate amid cheers from crowded galleries. Men who were sick have gone into Senate chambers and assembly halls to cast their vote for suffrage. Those who saw Representative Mann of Illinois, Sims of Tennessee, Barnhart of Indiana, and Crosser of Ohio come into the House of Representatives in Washington on that historic day, January 10th, 1918, when the federal suffrage amendment won its first great House victory, will never forget it. Similar sacrifices have been made at heavy personal expense in many a state capital. To the list of loyal men suffragists who have not only believed in suffrage, but proved it, was now added the name of Senator Block. A debate of several hours followed his appearance, each side fencing for the advantage. At 6 p.m. the vote was taken. Ayes 16, nays 14. One opponent changing his vote when he saw that the resolution was going to pass without him. After the Senate vote, a second vote was secured in the House by the opponents on the motion to reconsider. This resulted in a larger favorable majority than the first. On March 10th, West Virginia completed ratification. 34 ratifications now, and ever more persistent, grew the opposition as it saw that its time was short. On March 17th, Joseph Holt Gaines and W.E.R. Byrne, counsel for the West Virginia Anti-Suffrage League, sent telegrams to the governors of the states of Delaware, Connecticut, Vermont, Washington, and North Carolina, which read, quote, "We beg to inform you that the report that the proposed 19th Amendment was ratified by the legislature of West Virginia is not the fact, but on the contrary, the legislature refused to ratify the amendment. The facts are that the Senate, having refused to ratify, afterwards undertook in violation of its own rules to take action ratifying the amendment. That action, we claim, is absolutely void, and we are taking legal steps to enjoin any official certification or promulgation to the effect that West Virginia is now one of the states ratifying. We have taken the liberty of giving you this information because there has been an effort to suppress the full facts with reference to West Virginia's action." End quote. While they were notifying these governors that steps would be taken to prevent the certification of the West Virginia ratification, the certificate had already reached Washington, making West Virginia 34th in the ratification list received by the Secretary of State. Although the governor of Washington, Louis F. Hart, in August 1919, telegraphed his pledge to call a special session to the governors' conference and requested the other governors to join with him, it was not until March 22, 1920, that the legislature of Washington, last of the full suffrage states, met in special session and ratified the federal suffrage amendment. The session was called to provide funds for the maintenance of state schools. It was summoned after a conference with state regents and legislators who had supervision of appropriations for educational institutions because of a crisis in finances which might result in closing the University of Washington, the State College at Pullman, and several state normal schools. Both houses met in joint session to hear the governor's message. There was a tense expectation throughout the proceedings, since at any moment the wires might flash the news that Delaware, known to be meeting in special session, had ratified, in which case Washington would be the 36th state to ratify and would put the final seal on the full enfranchisement of the women of the entire nation. The ratifying resolution was introduced in the House by Representative Francis M. Haskell from Pierce County, who, the year before, had introduced the memorial to Congress for the passage of the federal suffrage amendment. Rules were suspended, and the resolution to ratify was adopted unanimously. 12 minutes after the resolution reached the Senate, it had been passed by another unanimous vote. 35 states had now ratified. Many of them had done so only because of the unceasing intensive ratification campaign waged by the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Again and again, the association had had to work its way through state situations of extreme complication. Continually, it had had to spur political leaders and political parties to further the struggle. Its representatives had had to fly from end to end of the country untiringly. It had had to agitate and educate and placate. Steadily the work had grown harder, state by state, through all the later ratifications. Step by step the opposition had grown grimmer. But the association knew, and the opposition knew, that whatever had gone before, whatever success in the result, however hard the work, the real fight was now at hand. Everything else paled into insignificance before the opposition's final attitude. Before it, every resource that suffragists possessed was going to be drained dry, every reliance be leaned on to the breaking point. Suffragists might have 35 ratifications till the crack of doom, but the 36th they should not have. That was the final attitude of the opposition. End of chapter 27. Read by Sandra.
Chapter 32 of Woman, Suffrage, and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by April 6090. Woman, Suffrage, and Politics. The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Shuler. The Struggle for the 36th State. The National Suffrage Association now called upon the two chairmen of the Republican and Democratic National Committees to secure the one ratification needed. The Republican leaders were determined that their record should not be blackened at the 11th hour, and Democratic leaders were equally sincere in the decision that defeat of final ratification should not be laid at their door. So both national chairmen again issued statements and vied with each other in efforts to influence lagging states. The Democrats considered 4 states which had not yet taken action: Tennessee, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, from which they hoped to secure one ratification, while the Republican Party looked to Connecticut, Vermont, and Delaware and felt sure of one ratification out of the 3 chances. In May, the Democratic National Committee and the National Democratic Convention in San Francisco passed strong resolutions. The one adopted by the convention called specifically upon Tennessee, North Carolina, and Florida to ratify the amendment. In Chicago, at the National Republican Convention, June 8th, correspondingly strong resolutions were passed. In July, the Woman Citizen, the official organ of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, carried an open letter to Senator Harding, the Republican nominee for President of the United States, in which the fact was cited that he now, as the executive agent and mouthpiece of the Republicans, became responsible if the party failed to complete ratification in time for the women to take part in the 1920 elections. At the same time, an urgent appeal was made to the Democratic nominee for president, James M. Cox. President Wilson was asked for cooperation in securing a special session in Tennessee and for assistance in North Carolina and Florida. One more state! Which would it be? Governors Marcus A. Holcomb of Connecticut and Percival W. Clement of Vermont, both anti-suffragists and anti-prohibitionists, were known to have entered into some kind of compact not to call their legislatures. They had been visited by deputations from the state auxiliaries of the National American Woman Suffrage Association in these states early in the summer of 1919, and petitions for special sessions had been refused. In all these months of ratification activity, neither governor had receded from the position then taken. The pressure brought to bear from within and without the states was unprecedented. Committees of men and women brought unquestioned evidence of popular demand. But interviews, petitions, resolutions of political conventions and appeals of party leaders went unheeded. In both states, the legislatures had been polled and would have ratified by large majorities if called. In Connecticut, the petition, signed by a majority of both houses asking for the special session, was waved aside by the governor and by the chairman of the Republican Party in the state, John Henry Roraback. These men had not only opposed the presidential suffrage bill proposed in the last Connecticut legislature, but in the days when suffragists had begged for opportunity to get the question before the voters of the state by a referendum, they had exerted all their efforts to prevent action. In Vermont, the women secured pledges from a majority of the legislatures to agree to pay their own expenses and give their time at a special session. Governor Clement still refused to call the session. In both states, the governors were in absolute control of the situation. In Connecticut, Governor Holcomb masked his opposition to the special session with the contention that the suffrage problem did not present the circumstances of special emergency under which he was authorized by the state constitution to convene the General Assembly in special session. In Vermont, Governor Clement disguised his opposition with the argument that, if the electors of this state are not allowed to vote upon the federal suffrage amendment, it seems only fair that it should be acted upon by a General Assembly selected with knowledge that it is to be acted upon by them. Over and over again, these men, urged by their party, the Republican, and arraigned before the bar of public opinion by the press, were given to understand that full responsibility rested upon them for their policy of obstruction. Why was it so difficult to get the 36th state? Why? The political machine that could make a president certainly could easily whip a reactionary or determined governor into line. The National Suffrage Association and all its state auxiliaries bent every energy to secure the sessions. When the governor of Connecticut announced that he was ready to receive proof of the existence of an emergency, the association offered its cooperation for a demonstration of nationwide strength to furnish the proof as a protest against the blocking of women's suffrage for the whole country. It organized, at a cost of $5,000, an emergency corps of 48 women, one from each state, doctors, lawyers, scientists, business and professional women, professors, and public officials, a group of women which in size, prominence, and ability had never been equaled in the United States. They met in New York May 2nd and received their instructions from the president of the association. At Hartford, they held a meeting. Then, separating into 4 groups of 12 each, they spoke in the chief cities of the state. Dividing again into groups of 4 each, they visited many of the smaller towns. With Connecticut women, they interviewed most members of the legislature. After a tour of 36 towns, with 41 meetings at which resolutions were passed unanimously, calling upon the governor to convene a special session, they came, on May 7th at 11:30 in the morning, to the Capitol. In short speeches, they answered the governor's objections and emphasized the national significance of their request. The governor replied that he would reserve his decision until he had carefully considered their arguments. 4 days later, he announced that, while the arguments proved a strong desire for a special session, they did not prove the existence of a special emergency, and he must decline. As time passed on, the situation became more and more exasperating. It seemed that these governors could not realize how the nation with its millions of people regarded their attitude and the position into which this emergency had thrust the political parties of the country. So a campaign was organized by the National Suffrage Association to get the voice of the people and the voice of the party into written form. In the result, hundreds of letters went to both governors, from prominent Republicans all over the country. The appeal was made from the standpoint of national emergency, and all reference to the presidential campaign was eliminated, in order that the country, in general, might have the facts regarding the delay in calling the session. The president of the Connecticut Auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association issued a manifesto which read in part, "Who is responsible for the delay which may keep 10 million women from the vote for president and about 20 million from the vote for members of Congress, state officials, etc.? Both great political parties, but the Republican in greater degree. It lies in the power of this party to speak the word that will fully enfranchise the women of this country. And where there is power, there is responsibility. You have withheld that one state which would make just the difference between our voting or not voting. An emancipator is not the man who takes the prisoner all the way to the door and lets him look out, but the man who actually unlocks the door and lets him go free. At the time of the state Republican convention, the Hartford Courant obligingly explained that the suffrage resolution it passed was a pretense, and it really meant nothing, a statement, it is only fair to say, repudiated by many honorable Republicans. Now it is Chairman Rohraback who, with happy unconsciousness that he is exhibiting his party in a yellow light, tells the public that the National Republican platform should not be taken seriously. The leaders of that party, he says, put the suffrage plank in to please women in the voting states. But they meant nothing by it. Are the men who are to lead a great party as double-faced and untrustworthy as Mr. Rohraback paints them? Were they laughing in their sleeves as they wrote the solemn pledges in the rest of the national platform? We wonder if Connecticut Republicans will let Mr. Rohraback smirch the party honor unchallenged. The course for the State Suffrage Association is clear. We must play our part in the sector of the national suffrage struggle, and we must let our opponents see that they cannot keep American citizens out of their fundamental rights with impunity. In the meantime, Republican women in the state organized a movement which pledged its members not to give money or work for the Republican Party as long as women remained unenfranchised. 3 Republican women went to Columbus, Ohio, and impressed upon the Republican Executive Committee there assembled that the sincerity of the party in regard to women's suffrage was being questioned. Another group waited upon Senator Harding and asked him to request the governor of Connecticut to call a special session. Senator Harding declined on the ground that it would be improper for him to make any suggestion to a fellow Republican on a great moral question. In August, when it was found that the Republican Party was taking credit for most of the ratifications already secured, but not bringing effective pressure on the Republican governors of Connecticut and Vermont, 30 women requested an audience with Mr. Will Hayes, chairman of the National Republican Committee, to ask him what the party was doing to secure ratification in Connecticut. He received them in the National Republican headquarters, New York City. The chairman of the Connecticut Auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association spoke for the deputation. She said in part, "What the women want is to vote in November. What the parties apparently want is a good record as a talking point in the coming campaign. What to the women is the supremely important thing is that 36th state. What to the parties seems to be most important is to exact their full due of gratitude from women who have not yet received the gift that was promised. In our own state, where the Republican Party is responsible, the women are actually being called upon to aid its campaign, while it is repudiating the policy and promises of the National Party in regard to ratification. From the time when suffrage became an issue, it has had the opposition of the leaders of the Republican Party in this state. Since the amendment passed Congress, they have resisted every expression of public opinion, every plea for ratification on grounds of justice and fair play. For a year, the suffragists have tried sincerely and patiently to work in and with the Republican Party to overcome the opposition, and have been cooperating with a Republican Men's Ratification Committee formed for this purpose. But we are apparently no nearer a special session than we were a year ago. During all this time, we have had no evidence that the National Republican Committee was really working in the state. We found it very difficult to reach you personally, and our appeals for specific help were ignored. Mr. Rohraback and Major John Buckley, Secretary to the Governor, have stated that they have never been asked by you to call a session. They evidently feel and wish the public to understand that the National Republican Committee has given them a free hand to pursue their obstructionist course. And to confirm this comes President-elect Harding's refusal to attempt to persuade Governor Holcomb. In the meantime, we women are being told that the Republican Party cannot be held responsible because the governor stands alone in his opposition. We submit that so long as the official leaders of the party in the state are in entire harmony with him in opposing us, and the national party keeps hands off, they are accomplices in his opposition and must be held responsible accordingly. And we further submit that if a national party is to come before the voters on the basis of its policies and promises, then it must be held responsible for making those promises good through its state branches. If the Connecticut Republican leaders can play a free hand without interference from the national party, then the party faces the alternative of either admitting powerlessness and disintegration, or of being an accomplice in the state's attitude of repudiation. Governor Holcomb still refused to call the session. In the meantime, Vermont women had not been idle. There the same vigorous efforts were put forth. The women conducted a remarkable campaign, providing new and ingenious methods of reaching Governor Clement, the last of which was made possible by the help of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, at a cost of $1,000. It was the organization of such a deputation as had never before been attempted by men of the state for any cause. 12 of the 14 counties were represented by 400 women who went to the state capital, overcoming the obstacles of long distances, almost impassable roads, and poor train service. Many came from towns remote from railroads, one woman walking 5 miles to the station. Others plowed through deep snow and over muddy and rocky roads before daylight. Reaching the capital, they marched, a silent army of loyal soldiers, through a cold, drenching rain, and took their places before the governor's chair. One by one, in a sentence or two, they presented Vermont's case. His response was that he did not care to make a decision at once. In addition to this demonstration, a campaign of letters and telegrams had been arranged to precede and follow the visit of the delegation, and 1,600 communications from all parts of the state went to the governor's desk. On June 29th, Governor Clement went to Washington, and both press and people believed that at last he would give way. Senator Harding, candidate of the Republican Party for President of the United States, and the governor both acknowledged that the call of a special session in Vermont had been discussed. Senator Harding said he told the governor he would be very glad to see this done, but made plain his desire not to interfere with the governor's prerogative. On July 12th, an official proclamation was issued by the governor, in which he stated that the federal constitution, in its present form, threatened the foundation of free popular government. He said, "The 16th Amendment, providing for a federal income tax, was lobbied through Congress and state legislatures by federal agents, and the 18th Amendment, for federal prohibition, was forced through by paid agents of irresponsible organizations with unlimited funds." Concerning what he called the proposal to force through the 19th Amendment for woman suffrage in the same manner, he said, "I will never be a party to any proceeding which proposes to change the organic law of the state without the consent of the people. The Constitution, he said, threatened free popular government alike as it stood and as it was interpreted by the Supreme Court. This decision leaves the people at the mercy of any group of men who may lobby a proposal for a change in the federal Constitution through Congress, and then through the legislatures of the states. The president of the National Suffrage Association issued an open letter to the governor, in the course of which she said, "A careful perusal of your proclamation refusing to call the legislature of Vermont into special session impresses the most casual reader with the conviction that you have doubtless told the truth, but not the whole truth. In order that this generation of your fellow-men and posterity may not misunderstand your position, the National American Woman Suffrage Association urges you to supplement your proclamation with replies to the following questions. Do you acknowledge that the federal Constitution is the supreme law of this land and supersedes all state constitutions wherever the two are in conflict? Do you challenge this fact that has stood unchallenged for 131 years? Do you know that on January the 10th, 1791, Vermont ratified that Constitution, although she had one of her own, and by so doing accepted the precedent of the federal Constitution over it, and by that act was admitted into the Union as a member of the United States of America? If you do know these facts of common knowledge, why did you throw over your refusal to call a special session, the camouflage of a dissertation about the alleged conflict between the Vermont and federal constitutions, which has nothing whatever to do with the calling of a special session of your legislature? Do you not know that when a legislature acts upon a federal constitutional amendment, it draws its authority from the federal and not the state constitution, and that the governor has no responsible part in the transaction, except as custodian of the amendment when it comes from the federal Secretary of State and returns to him with the certificate of ratification? Then why profess such a burden of personal responsibility in the matter? You profess to fear an invasion of states' rights and take upon yourself the responsibility of preserving the foundations of free popular government. Then why did you veto the presidential suffrage bill passed by the legislature of Vermont in 1919, which was strictly a state action and conferred the vote upon the women of Vermont alone? Your National Party Convention in 1920 called for completion of ratification in time for women to vote for the next president. Your party's National Committee, in the interim of conventions, took action 3 times, once asking the Congress to submit the suffrage amendment, once favoring early ratification, and once calling upon Republican governors to call special sessions in order that ratification might proceed. Your state party conventions, your party's state committee, your state legislature, hundreds of Vermont women, the chairman of the National Republican Committee and the chairman of your state Republican Committee, the candidate for president of your party, all have asked you to call a special session. This is a very distinguished and notable group, to be dismissed with the implication that your people are at their mercy. You owe it to the Republican Party and to the world to explain your assumption of an authority that belongs to your party leaders. By what right do you make this assumption? Governor Clement, tell it all. But Governor Clement did not call the session in Vermont. While the governors of Connecticut and Vermont persisted in their refusals to call the special sessions, attention was turned to Delaware, where there was hope. The history of Delaware on constitutional amendments had been unusual and strikingly irregular. Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution. It refused to ratify the 3 amendments proposed in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, did not reconsider its action until 1901, when its legislature accepted them. Delaware ratified the Income Tax Amendment, but the 17th Amendment, providing for direct election of United States senators, did not meet with the approval of the legislature. Although the state of Delaware, because of the attempt of rival candidates to influence the senatorship, had kept one of its seats vacant, one entire senatorial term. Delaware was the 9th state to ratify the 18th Amendment. This record did not tend to a favorable forecast of the fate of the 19th Amendment. But there were other things which did. Delaware was now a Republican state. In the Senate there were 12 Republicans and 5 Democrats. In the House, 23 Republicans and 12 Democrats. If the Republicans would adhere to their expressed party policy, the amendment could be ratified the first day of the session, and the Republican leaders did not minimize the ratification by the legislature of Delaware as a party asset. If Delaware failed to ratify, leaders argued their party would be held responsible for the defeat of the amendment, and reprisals at the polls might follow in the coming campaign from the women of the 31 states in which they now had presidential suffrage, exclusive of Vermont and inclusive of Kentucky, which in 1920 had been added to the list of states whose legislatures had given presidential suffrage to women. But Delaware, governed by provincial interests, failed to see the party importance of favorable action on the amendment. She was in the midst of a factional fight. The Republican Party in the state was divided into 2 groups, led by rival members of a single family. One of these was the National Committeemen. The state Republican chairman was a follower of the other faction. The National Republican chairman, perceiving that the only probable chance of a Republican ratification was in Delaware, sent favorable instructions to the Republicans of the state through the National Committeemen, instead of the state Republican chairman, which at once turned one faction against the amendment because the other was charged with its responsibility. It should also be said that had the message reached the state chairman, the other faction would probably have turned against it. Governor Townsend had delayed calling a special session because he feared action against the school code. A large sum had been offered to the state by Pierre DuPont for a much-needed extension of Delaware's public school facilities, contingent upon a like sum being raised by the state. The gift had been accepted by the legislature, and the necessary taxes had been assessed. The governor was fighting hard to raise the state from its 32nd place in educational ranks, but when it became apparent that Delaware was needed to complete ratification, he laid aside his fears for the code and issued a proclamation calling the session for March 22nd. Since the anti-Salisbury campaign, a campaign for ratification had been waged continuously in the state. The state auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association had secured resolutions from all kinds of state organizations favoring suffrage and immediate ratification, and had interviewed the legislatures and found a majority to be favorable. The state Democratic Committee endorsed ratification on January 22nd, and the Republican State Committee at a later date. Indications were so favorable that the women were unprepared for the weeks of intrigue that followed immediately upon the convening of the legislature. The people of Sussex, the most southern county, were particularly hostile to the school code and to suffrage. It was these county representatives, led by Daniel Layton, chairman of the Republican State Central Committee, former Governor Simon S.P. Pinwell, U.S. Senator Wolcott, and former Senator Salisbury, who eventually blocked ratification in the House. Daniel Layton had always been known as a suffragist, but because of his personal opposition to the governor, he publicly announced that he would defeat ratification. In his message to the 2 houses in joint session, the governor said, "Woman suffrage has been a subject of public discussion for over half a century. It is not an agitation of the moment. It is a world-wide question of right and wrong. Your supreme duty is to think and act for the good of your state and the nation. The responsibility is yours. Hundreds of telegrams from outside the state poured into Delaware daily. They came from the President of the United States, from Secretaries Daniels, Houston, and Meredith, and Attorney General Palmer of his cabinet, from Republican governors, state party chairmen, and interested party leaders throughout the country. Governor Townsend was one governor who did everything possible to secure ratification. He was a candidate for the National Republican Convention, and antagonism to him took the form of opposing his nomination as delegate. When he was given to understand by the opposition that ratification could be obtained only at the cost of his individual political humiliation, he called a meeting of Republican members of the legislature and withdrew his candidacy. The opposition, however, after making this proposal, failed to fulfill its part of the agreement, and now signed a round-robin letter declaring against ratification, which was circulated by the president of the Women's State Anti-Suffrage Association. John E. McNabb, the Democratic floor leader, boldly ignored the telegrams from President Wilson. Members of the cabinet, Homer Cummings, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and from other party leaders, he said that not 25 persons in his district favored ratification, and refused to retreat from his position, even though 2 days later a petition from 500 men and women of his district was handed to him. The small town of Dover was soon filled to overflowing with parties interested in the defeat of ratification. Among them were all the notable wet and railroad lobbyists of the state, reinforced by legislative workers and brewers' representatives from other states. Prominent men in high positions worked with them. Henry P. Scott of Wilmington, chairman of the State Republican Ways and Means Committee, widely circulated a statement which read, "If the legislature will refuse to ratify the proposed amendment and thus prevent the hysterical rout of the politicians of the country to make shreds and patches of our sacred Constitution, the state of Delaware will receive in the near future the greatest possible glory." On March 30th, word was received that the Mississippi Senate had ratified the suffrage amendment. This was followed by a telegram to the anti-ratificationists of Delaware that the Senate vote was only a flash in the pan and would be reconsidered. The Republican opponents in Delaware telegraphed to the Speaker of the House in Mississippi, "Stand firm against ratification. Delaware legislature still firm for doctrine of states' rights and will not ratify. We refuse to be stampeded and whipped into line by any party lash." The date for the House vote was fixed for March 31st, and defeat there seemed certain. But Assemblyman Hart, to whom, as the introducer, belonged the responsibility of bringing up the bill, left the Capitol for his home, thus making it impossible for action to take place. After a conference with anti-members, Representative Lloyd introduced an exact copy of the Hart resolution, so that its opponents might control the measure. Mr. Hart brought up his resolution the next day, April 1st, and it was defeated. Days passed. No further action was taken. The Republican Convention met in Dover April 20th, and the Delaware Auxiliary to the National Suffrage Association made a remarkable demonstration. Hundreds of suffragists arrived on every train, and in decorated automobiles. In themselves they constituted the best argument that could be made for ratification. Long petition sheets were exhibited with the names of 20,000 Delaware women asking for ratification. In the convention speech of its permanent chairman, a staunch suffragist, Robert Houston of Georgetown, Sussex County, was a strong appeal for ratification, and it called forth the great outburst of enthusiasm of the day. 2 weeks later, May 5th, the resolution to ratify the amendment was called up in the Senate, and a referendum to the voters which was offered as a substitute was defeated by a solid Republican vote of ayes 4, nays 13. The resolution to ratify was adopted, ayes 11, nays 6, 10 Republicans and 1 Democrat voting for, and 2 Republicans and 4 Democrats against it. The expectation was that action would be taken in the House on Friday. But on Thursday morning, a clear intention to defeat the resolution was revealed, and the bill was therefore placed under lock and key in the Senate. For in Delaware, bills were known to have been stolen. Senator Gormley Wet attempted to offer a motion ordering its delivery to the House, but was ruled out of order by the President pro tem. In the House, Vole McNabb launched an attack on those who were withholding the resolution and freely used the words bribery, cajoling, threats, interspersed with much profanity. The president of the anti-suffragists called out encouragement to him, and the Republican floor leader, William Lyons, had to ask her to stop in order that he might make his own speech. The Senate refused to send the resolution to the House, and an adjournment of the legislature was secured until May 17th, in the hope of bringing about a change of sentiment. Republican leaders interested in ratification met at the Capitol that day and pleaded with members to stand by their party, but to no avail. On May 28th, 3 days after the resolution had passed the Senate, it was sent to the lower house, read twice, and a motion was unanimously carried that the House resolved itself into a committee of the whole. A motion was next put to adjourn until 12:30, June 2nd, and it was carried. On June 2nd, Representative Lyons offered a motion that a vote be taken on the resolution. It was defeated by ayes 10, nays 24. The House thus placed itself on record against the amendment and ended all further legislative action on it in Delaware. The causes for defeat in Delaware were personal quarrels between party leaders, augmented by contests over local issues. This rendered the legislature particularly susceptible to the overwhelming appeals of the well-organized and powerful wet and railroad lobbies. The women antis, as usual, served to hide from the public the real character of the opposition. The failure of the legislature of the state of Delaware to ratify filled party leaders with such exasperation that suffragists saw hope that out of it one or the other of the parties would yet find the 36th state. End of chapter 37.
Chapter 29 of Women's Suffrage and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Women's Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Shuler. The Supreme Court speaks. Many eminent lawyers were convinced that even should the federal Supreme Court declare referenda on federal amendments in general invalid, such a decision would not apply to the state of Ohio, whose voters had amended the state constitution, especially providing for referenda after ratification of all federal constitutional amendments. It was held that a decision declaring a referendum in Ohio unconstitutional would apply to all other states, but that the reverse would not be true, a viewpoint that lent additional interest and significance to the Ohio case. The Ohio Supreme Court had handed down its opinion on September 30th, 1919, that a referendum on the ratification of the Prohibition Amendment was valid. Although an appeal was promptly taken to the federal Supreme Court, the Dries of the state recognized that there was no time to secure an opinion before the November election, and therefore proceeded to wage a campaign of preparation for the election contest. After they had lost by less than 500 votes, they called for a recount, and opinion among their forces seems to have been divided as to whether to expand the time and money necessary to secure a statewide recount or to wait for the federal Supreme Court decision, which they believed would declare the referendum void. It was not generally believed, however, that this appeal of the Ohio Dries was going to bring the much-anticipated federal decision, because the election it was supposed to prevent had already taken place. And whatever damage the Ohio taxpayer who brought the suit might suffer on account of an unnecessary election had already been suffered, and the decision could give him no redress. When the petitions were filed for a referendum on ratification of the suffrage amendment, George S. Hawk of Cincinnati, the man who had taken similar action in behalf of the Prohibition Amendment, filed a motion in the Court of Common Pleas, Franklin County, to enjoin the Secretary of State from putting the question on the ballot. By agreement, he secured prompt action in the minor court so that the case had passed through to the Supreme Court in the record-breaking time of 1 month. On November 11, 1919, that court announced its opinion as upholding the Franklin County courts and refusing to enjoin the Secretary of State. Mr. Hawk promptly appealed his case to the Supreme Court of the nation. Although there were a bewildering number of cases, much advertised as on their way to the Supreme Court, and although all the appeals from the referenda decisions of the Supreme Courts were supposed to be on the calendar of the federal court, the facts were that when the Supreme Court took recess on November 21, 1919, the only cases involving the referenda which were actually on the federal calendar were the two Hawk cases from Ohio. The one, prohibition, was regarded as mooted, the other, suffrage, as premature, since in the eyes of the law the suffrage amendment had not been ratified and might never be. Meanwhile, the presidents of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Ohio Auxiliary of the association held a conference with Mr. Hawk in Cleveland on December 9, 1919. Mr. Hawk was a young attorney connected with a group of the Prohibition Party wing of the Prohibition movement, which never come into unison with the Anti-Saloon League, the organization that was in control of the main campaign in Ohio and in the nation. He had attempted to enjoin the Secretary of State on the Prohibition Amendment case without the consent or knowledge of the Anti-Saloon League, as he had attempted to enjoin the suffrage case without the consent or knowledge of any suffrage association. He had allowed the National Anti-Saloon League to join with him in the argument on the referendum of the Prohibition ratification before the state Supreme Court, but he had done so through courtesy, not choice. When asked why, without consultation with the suffrage leaders of Ohio, he had challenged the anti-suffrage petitions, he replied that the Prohibition case, which he had appealed in the federal Supreme Court, was weak, since the election had taken place, and he wished to strengthen it. He was not, however, averse to taking the National American Women's Suffrage Association into partnership on his undertaking, and an agreement was made that this would be done, provided the council of the association so advised. The Honorable Charles E. Hughes had been engaged as the association's counsel, and no more able constitutional lawyer had the country produced. Mr. Hughes, Mr. Wayne Wheeler, the chief of counsel for the National Anti-Saloon League, and the Federal Department of Justice all advised that the Hawk case stood small chance of bringing forth the much coveted decision, but that decision would come soon on some one of the numerous and seemingly far more important cases. Mr. Hawk was, therefore, informed that the tentative agreement would not be carried out. Mr. Hawk had neither money of his own nor many supporters who could provide the costs of the appeal to the Supreme Court. But he had faith in his case, and the most valuable of American traits, stick-to-itiveness. He took the matter up with Frank J. Hanley, one-time governor of Indiana, and for some years a fearless advocate of prohibition. He too had not yielded the prestige of the Prohibition Party leadership to the Anti-Saloon League. A small group had established the Flying Squadron Foundation, which played an independent part in the Prohibition drama. Mr. Hanley was an able lawyer, and to him, Mr. Hawk, young, unknown, made his appeal. There was no money to reward him, perhaps none for printing, unless it could be gathered from friends. An always difficult task, made more difficult by the fact that all the nation knew that the decision must soon be forthcoming, anyway, from one of the many cases coming up from other states. Yet Mr. Hawk persuaded Mr. Hanley to join him, and on February 7, 1920, their briefs were filed with the court. On February 25th, reply briefs were filed with Attorney General Price of Ohio as counsel, and on June 2, 1920, to the amazement of all the most interested lookers-on, the Supreme Court selected the Hawk cases upon which to send their waiting nation the great decision, long expected and crucial. The decision was that there could be no state referenda on federal amendments. The entire question was involved in a single query. What is a legislature? Is it a small legislative body elected by the people? Or may the legislative function be extended to the people themselves as the initiative, and Referendum Act extended it. The briefs on the Kentucky distillers, the warehouse company, the liquor dealers of New Jersey, and later the state of New Jersey, the state of Rhode Island, and the appeals from state Supreme Court decisions, now wet, now dry, had all expanded much time and space on the referendum proposition. Charles E. Hughes, on behalf of the 22 states, Rhode Island, Delaware, North Carolina, Kentucky, Louisiana, Indiana, Alabama, Maine, Arkansas, Michigan, Florida, Oregon, Kansas, West Virginia, Nevada, Nebraska, Montana, North Dakota, South Carolina, Wyoming, Utah, and Arizona, which as amicus curiae filed briefs on the Rhode Island case, summed up the whole matter in a masterly fashion. The chief points of argument for the right of referendum on the federal amendments were: 1. The initiative and referendum was unknown when the Constitution was written, but it is the establishment of an enlarged legislature created by the will of the people. 2. In the words of Attorney General Price of Ohio, the voters of the states have the power to abolish their general assemblies and to take into their own hands all matters of legislation. Such authority as the legislatures have to ratify amendments to the federal Constitution is not mandatory but permissive. The state of Ohio did take from the legislature some of its authority and vest it with the people when it established the initiative and referendum. The chief points in argument against the right of referendum on federal amendments were: 1. The federal Constitution is the supreme law of the land and supersedes all state constitutions and state statutory laws in authority. 2. The federal Constitution clearly indicates the method of its own amendment, and this provides that the amendment must first be submitted by a 2/3 vote of the two houses of Congress, and then must be ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states. 3. A vast amount of evidence has been gathered to show that the federal Constitution clearly indicates the elected body known as legislatures, when it said legislatures. The discussion which resulted in the adoption of the federal Constitution made that point quite clear. 4. While the states have full authority to change their own constitution and laws in any manner they choose without consulting the federal government, they have no power to change the meaning of the federal Constitution. And, since the federal Constitution has never been amended so as to give authority to any state to choose a different method of ratification of a federal amendment than that prescribed by the Constitution itself, the interpretation of the meaning of the word legislature today is precisely the same as that in existence when the Constitution was written. 5. In the opinion rendered by the U.S. District Court of New Jersey is the following. In Article 5, 2 methods are authorized for the ratification of amendments, one by convention and the other by legislatures. If the method by convention had been chosen, would the ratifying action by the convention have been subject to the referendum vote by the people? Manifestly not, if the express language of the Constitution is conclusive. And if not, where is the warrant for holding that ratification by the legislatures requires such a referendum vote? 6. To those who hold that the initiative and referendum laws may be held as having control over the federal Constitution, the question is directed as to whether the people of any state could initiate a federal amendment. By common consent, it is agreed that this was not within the intent of the law. If one part of the law fails in application to federal matters, how can the other be held to be applicable? The federal Constitution, and not the constitutions of the several states, controls the method by which the U.S. Constitution may be amended. The decision was announced in glaring headlines from ocean to ocean, and followed by editorial comment by all the leading newspapers of the country. Mr. Hanley's own newspaper, the National Enquirer, Indianapolis, said, "The Supreme Court of the United States has spoken, and in its words were double charged with life and death, life for the 2 great amendments to the federal Constitution, the 18th, the Prohibition Amendment, and the 19th, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, and the death to every state referendum endeavor, legislative or constitutional." having for its purpose the change of the method of amendment of the Constitution or the placing of limitation upon the ratifying power of state legislature. In the judgment it has rendered in the two cases of George S. Hawk versus Harvey C. Smith, Secretary of State of Ohio, it has written finis upon the grave of the hopes of the wet interests, so far as they were based on the state referendums of legislative ratification of either of these amendments. The decision is of vast importance, not only because of its conclusiveness as to these amendments, but as to all future amendments which may be submitted, and because of its reiteration of the supremacy of the national covenant. The decision blasts the most substantial hope the wet interests had. The cases were defended by the great array of able counsel, especially employed by the liquor interests, and the litigation contested with stubborn determination and by the exercise of every resource and skill of learning and experience they possessed. Eminent counsel had advised that no decision could be had on the merits of the cases for lack of jurisdictional facts. The law officers of the government, when invited to appear and assist in the presentation of the cases, had declined to do so because of what, in their judgment, was lack of jurisdiction. All in all, it is a signal victory for Mr. Hawk, the plaintiff in error, for counsel, for the causes whose fate was so intimately involved, for the American people, and for their unborn posterity. At last, the threatened referenda on the suffrage amendment were no longer legally possible. Maine had not filed petitions, as its own state court had declared them illegal. The petition in Massachusetts was thrown out because of insufficiency in number of names. Missouri let the time limit for filing petitions pass, and it is uncertain whether they were ever circulated. In Texas, the primary law had been declared constitutional by the Supreme Court, as had been the presidential suffrage law in Nebraska. With ratification completed, the referenda filed on presidential suffrage in Ohio and Maine became futile, and even aside from ratification, the Supreme Court of the nation would without doubt declare referenda on presidential suffrage unconstitutional, as the authority for it was likewise drawn from the federal Constitution. One by one, the legal attacks fell away from the amendments, like barnacles from a ship in fresh water. The opponents set forth more publicity, in which they angrily warned the nation that should another state ratify, and the women be thereby allowed to vote in the coming election, the entire presidential election would have to be thrown out, since they were still prepared to invalidate the amendment. As the method for doing so was not clearly revealed, the threats, although widely published, were accepted as expressions of temper on the part of the supporters of the fast-losing cause. The decision of the Supreme Court did more than clear the suffrage field of legal entanglements. It pointed to the door of the 36th state, and toward this door suffragists turned with hurrying feet. End of Chapter 29. Recording by Tori B.
Chapter 30, Part 1 of Women's Suffrage and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Women's Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Shuler, Tennessee, Part 1. When on June 2, 1920, the United States Supreme Court rendered that, to suffrage, momentous decision that state referenda were not permissible, 35 states had ratified the suffrage amendment, 8 had defeated ratification. The final decision therefore rested with the remaining 5 states that had not yet taken any action. These states were the northern states of Connecticut and Vermont, and the southern states of North Carolina, Florida, and Tennessee. The poll of the legislatures of North Carolina and Florida indicated an adverse majority, so of course these states were expected to take adverse action in accord with the remainder of the South. This limited the immediate prospect of the 36th ratification to Connecticut, Vermont, and Tennessee. None of the legislatures of these states was in session, so none could ratify unless its governor called a special session. Responsibility thus narrowed down to the governors of the 3 states. Temporarily, the case of Tennessee was dismissed from consideration because of an amendment in its state constitution which read, Article 3, Section 32. No convention or general assembly of the state shall act upon any amendment of the Constitution of the United States proposed by Congress to the several states, unless such convention or general assembly shall have been elected after such amendment is submitted. Florida's Constitution also contains this provision. This provision of the Tennessee Constitution had stood unchallenged for half a century and was accepted as prohibiting a special session for the purpose of ratifying the suffrage amendment. There was no longer any doubt of the ratification of the amendment if it could be put before any one of the three legislatures of Connecticut, Vermont, and Tennessee. All were favorable to ratification, and the general sentiment in these states was not only very friendly, but the Republicans in the one-party Republican states of Connecticut and Vermont, and the Democrats in the one-party Democratic state of Tennessee were pledged to aid ratification. Yet the presidential election of 1920 was coming nearer and nearer, with women's chance to vote in it hanging upon a 36th ratification, and that ratification hanging upon a special session. It was believed that the governor of Tennessee could not call such a session. As has already been shown, the governors of Connecticut and Vermont would not. Feeling was tense and irritable throughout the country. Suffragists regarded the situation with the amazed irascibility of a plaintiff given a verdict by a jury, but with the judgment mysteriously and suspiciously withheld. A more surprising manifestation came from hundreds, if not thousands, of women who had taken no part and had shown no especial interest in the campaign for suffrage, but who now developed a more raucous attitude toward the delay than did the better disciplined suffragists. Women whose sympathies with the suffrage struggle had never been apparent now because the 36th state was not more speedily achieved, even went so far as to throw bitter invective at suffragists who had given the whole potentiality of their lives to the cause. There were other causes of irritation. After the ratification of the 35th state on March 22nd, political leaders had concluded that there would be a 36th state and that millions of women would vote in November. The prediction had been widely heralded that these new voters might turn the scale in the coming election, and in consequence a hectic effort to enroll them in advance had been made by all parties. Suffragists, non-suffragists, and anti-suffragists had been appointed to official posts, and the first duty assigned them had been the organization of the coming women voters. Although hosts of women flocked to the organizing meetings, many declined to be organized as voters before they had attained that dignity. National chairmen of the political parties were harassed on the one hand by suffragists and their state party organizations, who entreated them to use every possible effort to find a 36th state, and on the other by women anti-suffragists and a powerful party minority, threatening a variety of disasters were that state found. Two considerations tipped the scales suffrageward. One, that the politics of the 36th state might easily be a determining factor in the coming presidential election. The other, that if there should be no 36th ratification, each dominant party would be held blamable, and the premature organization of women might prove a boomerang. It was in the midst of this impasse that the Supreme Court handed down its decision. It validated all the ratifications already effected, cleared the amendment of legal doubt, and emphasized the fact that completed ratification required the action of only a single state. Immediately a fresh campaign to persuade the two northern governors to action was begun, and the Republican Party left no stone unturned to persuade them to call special sessions, but neither would budge. It left the Republicans, whose majorities in Congress had submitted the amendment and whose proportion of the state ratifications was the larger, seemingly unable to deliver the 36th state. Meanwhile, Democratic hopes had turned slowly but steadily to Tennessee. Colonel Joseph H. Acklin, General Counsel of the Tennessee Suffrage Association, on May 11th, had published an opinion in the Nashville Banner declaring that should the Supreme Court of the United States hold that ratification of federal amendments may be accomplished only by the exact procedure outlined in the federal Constitution, then Section 32 of Article 3 of the Tennessee Constitution would be abrogated and a called session could legally ratify the suffrage amendment. The opinion attracted little attention at the time, but it convinced the women of the state auxiliary of the National Suffrage Association. That auxiliary was now known as the Tennessee League of Women Voters. Its old title was the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association. At their annual convention a week later, they discussed this situation and determined to be on watch. The decision clearly recognized and applied the principle that no state possessed the authority to alter or modify in any way whatsoever the method of amending the Constitution, and Colonel Ackland urged the Tennessee League of Women Voters to agitate the question of a special session. This the League lost no time in doing. Telegraphing to the headquarters of the National Suffrage Association for help, it turned its forces to the problem of converting the state press, the governor, and the legislature to the idea that the Supreme Court decision had made ratification in Tennessee possible. Its first appeal was made to the State Democratic Convention. The convention, with enthusiastic applause, carried a hearty resolution endorsing ratification of the amendment and recommending a special session. Armed with this resolution, the women requested the governor to call the legislature. The National Suffrage Association added its request, but he gave them no encouragement. "There will be no extraordinary session of the 61st General Assembly," said he. "I am forbidden by the Constitution of Tennessee to call an extra session of the legislature to act upon any amendment to the Constitution of the United States. That matter is delegated to the succeeding General Assembly." The agitation proceeded nevertheless. The Tennessean, the Chattanooga News, and the Tennessee League of Women Voters were simultaneously taking a poll of the legislature and from time to time publishing interviews with the legislators. On June 20, the governor, still believing that Tennessee had no authority to ratify, again declined to call a session. The newspapers were timidly discussing the possibilities of the session, the suffragists alone being confident. It was then that the chairman of the Tennessee Ratification Committee wrote the National Suffrage Association, "Our only hope lies in Washington. In Tennessee, all swear by Woodrow Wilson. No one here believes he has clay feet." The Democratic State Convention on the 8th of June exhausted every adjective in our voluminous Southern vocabulary to approve, praise, and glorify his every word and deed. If he will but speak, Tennessee must yield. Inspired by our faith, the entire State Board of the League of Women Voters, 32 women, signed a telegram to the President urging him to ask Governor Roberts to call the session and assuring him that the legislature would ratify if called. A copy of the telegram was sent to the National Suffrage Headquarters, and with it a plea for more help. Through its Washington representative, the National American Woman Suffrage Association secured the intercession of President Wilson, who asked the United States Department of Justice to render an opinion to the Tennessee governor concerning the application of the Supreme Court decision to the Constitution of Tennessee. This was done within an hour by Assistant Attorney General Ryerson, a citizen of Tennessee, and the following was made public by the White House in the afternoon, 15 hours after the telegram had been sent from Nashville. The ruling of the Supreme Court in the recent Ohio case, and the consideration which I gave to this question in preparing these cases for hearing, leaves no doubt in my mind that the power of the legislature to ratify an amendment of the federal Constitution is derived solely from the people of the United States through the federal Constitution and not from the people through the Constitution of the state. The power thus derived cannot be taken away, limited, or restrained in any way by the Constitution of a state. The provision of the Tennessee Constitution, if valid, would undoubtedly be a restriction upon that power. If the people of a state through their Constitution can delay action on an amendment until after an election, there is no reason why they cannot delay it until after 2 elections or 5 elections, or until the lapse of any period of time they may see fit, and thus practically nullify the article of the federal Constitution providing for amendment. On the same day, President Wilson telegraphed Governor Roberts, "It would be a real service to the party and to the nation if it is possible for you, under the peculiar provision of your state constitution, having in mind the recent decision of the Supreme Court in the Ohio case, to call a special session of the legislature of Tennessee to consider the suffrage amendment. Allow me to urge this very earnestly." Governor Roberts had no prejudices per se against the special session, for on March 11th he had announced that he would call a special session of the legislature when and if the amendment should be ratified by 36 other states, in order to preclude the possibility of contesting elections in which women had voted without previous enactment of state laws relating to the payment of poll tax and registration. With the proposal of the President, supported by the Ryerson letter, a new light was thrown on the political screen. The next day, June 24th, an elaborate opinion was handed the governor at his request by State Attorney General Frank M. Thompson, which declared that ratification of the suffrage amendment by a special session would be legal. The National American Woman Suffrage Association on June 25th gave to the public the opinion of Honorable Charles Evan Hughes, its counsel. In part it said, "The provision of the Constitution of Tennessee attempts to take away from an existing legislature of that state the authority to ratify the amendment as proposed by Congress for ratification by the legislature, and to place this authority in a legislature subsequently chosen. This, in my opinion, is beyond the power of the state. In the adoption of the federal Constitution, the state assented to the method of ratification by the state legislature without any such qualification, and the state legislature, sitting as such after the amendment has been duly proposed by Congress, has, in my judgment, full authority to ratify." Chief Justice Clark of the North Carolina Supreme Court volunteered a similar opinion. The widely published opinions of these high legal authorities of both dominant parties instantaneously changed the direction of expectation throughout the nation. Democratic presidential candidates sent drastic telegrams to the governor urging that Tennessee put an end to the uncertainty of the women's vote. In response to combined entreaties, the governor announced that he would call a session, whereupon a long-drawn breath of relief swept over the nation. Newspapers carried the news that the Democratic state of Tennessee had come forward as the gallant rescuer of the befogged suffrage amendment. Cartoonists discovered a wide diversity of humorous features with which to carry the same message, and Tennessee, the perfect 36, became the talk of the hour. Democrats were exultant, Republicans exceedingly generous. The relief and joy in suffrage and political party headquarters were not, however, universal. The opposition had not given up hope, and it now gathered its forces for the most terrific battle it had ever waged. That battle might have been a mere flurry had it not been for two unfortunate facts. First, the political situation within the state was the worst possible for united action on any measure, and second, the Tennessee League of Women Voters was ill qualified at that particular date to take care of so serious a campaign. Tennessee had been a Democratic state since the Civil War, although 1/3 of its legislature was Republican. The Republicans came mainly from the eastern mountain regions, which had remained loyal to the Union in the Civil War and loyal to the Republican Party ever after. They were regarded by the majority party with frigid tolerance, and the only time that there were Republican victories in the state was when there were rifts in the Democratic forces. In one-party states, the normal party antagonisms practically cease, but the instincts for division reappear as factions in the majority party. In Tennessee, these factions within the Democratic Party were now at each other's throats. State citizens anxiously shook their heads, remembering a similarly bitter occasion when a shocking murder had resulted from a factional political quarrel. The prevailing fear that a tragedy might ensue, or that the state might be thrown into the hands of the Republicans, tended to widen the breach as each group laid the responsibility for the gravity of the situation upon the other. A persistent rumor, untraceable to any definite source, ran through each faction to the effect that the Republicans, provided with unlimited funds, were making a deal with the leaders of the opposing faction. Suspicion, animosity, and uncompromising hate possessed the entire state. The governor was a candidate to succeed himself against two rival candidates. A whispering campaign of scandal involving the governor was traveling fast. Every person in the state was classified as for or against him. No neutrals were permitted, and when workers sent by the National Suffrage Association entered the state, they were regarded with suspicion, each side accusing them as favorable to its rival. The governor, obviously indifferent in his own feelings toward the question of women's suffrage, now found it an exceedingly troublesome issue. His political opponents alternately charged that he did not intend to call the extraordinary session, or if he did, that he and his friends could be depended upon to dish the amendment. Whatever the harried governor's personal impulse may have been, he was certainly much disturbed by these opposing conditions and weighed the question to call or not to call each day with varying conclusions. Many Tennessee women had been anxious to vote in the primaries on August 5th, and might have done so had the session been called at once. The rival candidates' forces therefore scolded, threatened, ridiculed, and dragooned the governor in the effort to get him to call a special session, and they were without doubt not a little moved in their anxiety for early action by the hope that the scandal afloat would drive the new women voters into their camp. On the other hand, the governor's friends, recognizing that possibility, assured him daily that enfranchising the woman before August 5th would be equivalent to putting a weapon in the hand of his enemy with which to slay him. So suffragists and the opponents of suffrage in state and nation watched, waited, and grew wroth, while embittered Tennessee fought her way to and through the primaries. Most unfortunately of all, perhaps, some of the leading Democratic women suffragists of the state had yielded to urging from their men and become involved in the political quarrel, some being arrayed on the governor's side, some on the other. Although the active and efficient chairman of the Ratification Committee of the State Auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association was strictly neutral, the governor refused to deal with her on the ground that she belonged in the enemy camp. He appointed his own committee of women to work for ratification, with a former president of the Tennessee Suffrage Association as its chairman. Then he announced that he would call the special session for August 9, 4 days after the primaries. Meanwhile, the chairman of the governor's committee of women hurriedly began to organize and to take a poll of the legislature. At the same time, she appealed to the National Suffrage Association for official recognition of her committee. The Tennessee League of Women Voters had no objection to its one-time president, but she was not, at the moment, an officer. Other women were officers and responsible to their constituency for the success of ratification. These women found themselves in the curious position of having their official duty taken from them by the governor. He had summarily waved aside the organization which had produced the conditions that made ratification possible. As the Equal Suffrage Association, it had blazed the trail through the early gloom of Tennessee prejudice, and later had conducted without pause the agitation, education, and organization which had so largely converted the state to the justice of women's suffrage. At the moment, the local groups of the League, under direction of their congressional chairman, were engaged in getting the poll of the legislature. It was the usual routine with all auxiliaries of the National Suffrage Association, the principle being applied that the legislator was responsible to his constituency, and that they alone should solicit his voting pledge. Without the League and its many connections, ratification was dubious. The National Suffrage Association, dismayed at this unexpected tangle within its own forces, sent a representative to reconnoiter. A call upon the governor's staff confirmed the rumor that the chief executive was surrounded by a hostile group who not only did not want the session called, but would prevent it if they could. From both friends and foes of the governor, it was learned that the session was considered doubtful. The governor's tactical mistake in appointing an independent women's committee was recognized by his enemies at its full value, and the Tennessean, the leading newspaper in Nashville, had a series of editorials and cartoons in readiness with which it intended to lampoon him in relentless fashion. Perceiving that such an attack would arouse the governor's friends to urge the withdrawal of the promise of a session, the representative of the National American Woman Suffrage Association pleaded for delay in the publication. This was reluctantly granted. The governor was campaigning afield, but a doughty Leaguer, driving her own car, took the representative to the place of his next meeting. In a brief midnight interview, she pleaded for a compromise which would enable the recognition of both committees by the National Suffrage Association and by the governor. The plea was graciously granted, and she returned to Nashville with the signed compromise in her pocket at 5 o'clock in the morning, having motored all night. The Tennessean would not accept the agreement. Then further delay was begged until the president of the National Suffrage Association could reach Nashville. This plea, too, was granted, and a hurry telegram was sent to New York. On June 15th, the president of the association, after a 12 hours' notice, started for Tennessee, expecting to remain less than a week. But it was not until the comedy tragedy of the Tennessee ratification passed into history more than 2 months later that she was able to return. The Tennessean reluctantly withheld its planned attack upon the governor, and in an interview with the chief executive on Sunday, August 18th, between trains, the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association assured him that the association recognized that ratification would be accomplished only by his aid and the aid of his followers in the legislature. that it was not interested in the local politics of any state, that it recognized the governor's right to appoint any committee he chose, but that it could not repudiate its own auxiliary. She pointed out that there were Republicans in the legislature and also Democrats of the opposing faction. She undertook to guarantee that the officers of the League of Women Voters would neither work for nor against him, but would give their undivided attention to ratification. From that moment, the National Suffrage President served as a liaison officer between the governor and the suffragists, and found the position most delicate and difficult. The National Suffrage Association knew one thing that Tennessee did not know, and that was that the opposition meant to wage a desperate and probably unscrupulous battle to prevent ratification in the 36th state. It knew that every weak man would be set upon by powerful forces, and that every vulnerable spot in the campaign would be discovered and attacked in its vulnerability. It knew that the chances of success depended upon preparedness to the last buckle on the last strap. It was no easy task to arouse either men or women to comprehension of the dire need of the hour. All factions professed to stand for ratification. Both the National Democratic and the National Republican committees had urged the governor to call a special session and the legislature to ratify. Both Democratic and Republican national platforms had confirmed this request. Both Democratic and Republican state conventions had urged a special session and ratification. The legislature about to be called had extended presidential and municipal suffrage to women, and more than a majority of its members were pledged to ratification. Suffrage men were inclined to pooh at any expression of doubt as to the result. Yet there was not long to wait before warnings against false security began to materialize. The opposition began its work with an old campaign device. In order that legislators might save their faces when they should repudiate their pledges, a plausible excuse must be found. Suddenly there appeared in the press, and directly after in every street-corner conversation, the remarkable claim that those legislators who voted for ratification would violate their oath of office. It was held that though ratification might be legal if secured by the legislature, called into special session for the purpose, that fact did not free men from their oath to uphold the state constitution as it read, even if it included an invalid provision. Every wheel in the opposition machinery was set in motion to spread this idea and to fix it indelibly in the minds of Tennessee. The Anti-Suffrage Press hammered it home in daily editorials. Anti-suffrage lawyers, surprisingly ignorant of the relation of the federal constitution to state constitutions, contributed further confusion to the situation by labored opinions on the inviolability of the oath of office. Men who had never been credited with political virtue came forward to warn legislators of the wickedness of voting for ratification under such circumstances. The Bar Association, in session, contained so many members who held this remarkable view that the Friends of Suffrage present did not introduce an intended resolution favoring ratification, lest it be rejected. With amazing docility, intelligent men fell into the trap, and for 3 weeks this device of the opposition threatened defeat of the amendment in the special session. It was obviously the first duty of suffragists to destroy this legal contention. An invitation to address a luncheon of the Kiwanis Club of Nashville gave the president of the National Suffrage Association an opportunity to discuss it. An excerpt was published in all leading papers of the state, and for the first time, the answer to the claim, which had already gained widespread and distinguished support, was put squarely before the people of the state. She said, "Those who are urging that legislators who vote for ratification will be violating their oath to support the state constitution forget that every legislator takes an oath of loyalty to 2 constitutions. The oath is no more in support of one than of the other. In fact, the obligation to take an oath to support the Constitution comes from the Federal Constitution, Article 6, Section 3. The possibility of conflict between the two was foreseen, and the Federal Constitution, Article 5, Section 2, declares that to be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. The legislator does not vote to nullify the Tennessee Constitution when he votes to ratify the federal suffrage amendment. Any part of a state constitution is already nullified when it conflicts with the federal constitution. His oath first supports the federal constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, and second, such portions of the Tennessee Constitution as are in agreement with the federal Constitution, for all others, including the provision in question, would be held to be nullified and to all intents non-existent should the question of their legality ever reach the Supreme Court. Committees were hurriedly appointed in all the chief towns and cities, and suffragists were given instructions to visit all influential lawyers and secure either an opinion upon the mooted point or their signature to an opinion on the question. When a legislator takes a joint oath to support the federal and the state constitutions, does he violate his own oath when voting in accord with the provisions of the federal constitution? As fast as these opinions were secured, they were printed by the favorable press. After a 2 weeks' vigorous campaign in this direction, a large majority of the important lawyers of the state were publicly recorded against the assumption. A tour of the chief cities of the congressional districts was next planned and a hurry call issued to the local groups in each district to send their leaders forward for conference with the state and national officers of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. There were public meetings, newspaper interviews, talks with political leaders, and a private conference with workers at each point. At the conferences, the poll of all legislators from the districts was carefully reviewed, and arrangements were made for deputations of constituents, or a succession of them, if needed, to wait on every member not already pledged to vote favorably on ratification in the special session. To every conference the question was put, "Are there any known bribable legislators from your district?" Sometimes the entire group ejaculated a name in unison, so well established was some legislators' ill repute in this connection. The same question was put to all political leaders in private talk, and was often met by a surprised look of suspicion, to be quickly covered by an expression of canny determination not to reveal any names. However, further discussion usually secured the names. All such names were checked by a secret mark on the poll list. Several names were checked as bribable by 8 different persons, each thoroughly acquainted with practical politics and each having given his opinion without the knowledge of the others. The women of Tennessee, alarmed by the unexpected development of hostility, and now understanding the false grounds for their belief in prompt action, laid aside their political differences and worked together in a manner worthy of imitation by the men of the state. The southern summer heat was merciless, and many legislators lived in remote villages or on farms miles from any town. Yet the women trailed these legislators by train, by motor, by wagons, and on foot, often in great discomfort, and frequently at considerable expense to themselves. They went without meals, were drenched in unexpected rains, and met with tire troubles. Yet no women faltered, and there was not a legislator who had not been visited by his women constituents before the legislature met. In many instances, members were visited by deputations of men or by joint delegations of men and women. Each day the poll was corrected in Nashville as the reports of interviews were received by wire and by mail. Each day the prospects were carefully estimated. Although several men under suspicion as bribable had signed pledges to vote for ratification, they were never included in the private estimate. It was intended to make the poll so safe that it would not be endangered if the bribable fell from it. The problem of arriving at an exact account of the ayes and nays was embarrassed by the fact that 10 vacancies existed, and by the further fact that there was a question of the eligibility of certain members to serve at the special session, since they had been appointed to public office after the regular session. Meanwhile, the need of added political influence was not forgotten. The Democrats having announced that the National Committee would meet in Columbus on July 19 in connection with the ceremonies of notifying Governor Cox of his nomination for the presidency, the National Suffrage Association appointed a committee of Democratic women to be present under the leadership of a director of the association who was also a proxy member of the committee. This committee presented a memorial from the association and made 3 definite requests. 1. A resolution of endorsement. 2. An expression from Mr. Cox. 3. The appointment of a representative of the Democratic Committee to go to Tennessee and North Carolina to work for ratification. Representatives of the National Suffrage Association further advised the Democratic National Committee that suffragists were surfeited with resolutions and that what the women of the country desired was that the Democratic Committee should use its full power to bring about ratification in states like Tennessee and North Carolina and not content itself with the mere adoption of a resolution. All that was asked was done. The committee resolved its hope for Tennessee ratification. 2 Tennesseans were privately appointed as national representatives of the party to work for ratification, and candidate Cox gave a frank and urgent request for Tennessee's ratification. At his own request, 2 private conferences with the National Suffrage Association's committee were held, and he agreed that he would come to Tennessee on his campaign trip, if needed, to urge ratification. As an additional expression, he wired the president of the National Suffrage Association, "I'm gratified over the news that you are to remain in Nashville for the ratification campaign. It gives me added reason for expressing confidence that the Tennessee legislature will act favorably, which will greatly please the Democratic Party." The Republicans unexpectedly called their national committee to meet at Marion on July 21st in connection with their notification ceremonies. The National Suffrage Association thereupon hastily appointed a committee of Republican women and provided it with a memorial similar to that sent to the Democratic Committee and instructed it to make the same requests. The committee passed the following resolution: Resolved, that it is the sense of the Executive Committee of the Republican National Committee that the Republican members of the Tennessee Legislature should be, and hereby are, most earnestly urged and requested by this resolution to vote unanimously for ratification of the woman suffrage amendment in the special session of the Tennessee Legislature which is to be called, and the chairman of the Republican National Committee is hereby authorized to communicate this resolution to each Republican member of said legislature. This was wired to each Republican member of the Tennessee legislature and confirmed by letter. The National Suffrage Association's committee then called upon Mr. Harding, who declared that he was ready to throw the full weight of his influence for ratification, and the news was sent broadcast by the many correspondents then in Marion. Mr. Harding also wired the president of the National Suffrage Association and gave the message to the press himself. "I am exceedingly glad to learn that you are in Tennessee seeking to consummate the ratification of the equal suffrage amendment. If any of the Republican members of the Tennessee Assembly should ask my opinion as to their course, I would cordially recommend an immediate favorable action." The opposition had been at work for several weeks upon a plan to defeat ratification by a solid Republican adverse vote, on the ground that, should Tennessee ratify, the Democrats would get the credit. The rumor of this had been persistent and disconcerting. The action of the National Republican Committee at Marion and the endorsement of presidential candidate Harding checked that effort, but did not eliminate it from the possibilities. Representative Fess, chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee, now urged each Republican member of the legislature by telegram to join in a solid vote for ratification. Several state committeemen and Harding clubs wired the Republican chairman of Tennessee, H. H. Clements of Knoxville, urging a solid vote for ratification. He publicly announced that he did so urge the Republican members of the legislature, and added, "I feel safe in pledging every Republican member of the Senate and House for the immediate ratification of the amendment." Later, the National Republican Committee sent a member, Mrs. Harriet Taylor Upton, to Nashville to join the Republican legislators in the counter-campaign to secure a solid party vote for ratification. The combination of these influences secured nearly all the Republican votes for ratification. Without them, ratification would have failed. Although the public announcement had been made a month before that the special session would be called for August 9th, the official call was not issued until August 7th. The ratification resolution went before the legislature with the strongest political support it had had in any state or at any time. The preparations were complete. When, on July 25th, the poll had shown a certain majority, the announcement had been given to the public, while deputations continued to visit the doubtful members and meetings were still held. A. L. Todd, presiding officer of the Senate, and Seth Walker, Speaker of the House, had agreed to introduce the resolution to ratify. Most of the best-known lawyers of the state, including the Attorney General, had given opinions not only upon the constitutionality of ratification by the Tennessee legislature, but upon the specific question as to whether men would violate their oath of office if they should vote for ratification, so that the argument which 3 weeks before had threatened to send the resolution to defeat had been largely eliminated from the field. The League of Women Voters, the Governor's Committee of Women, the Democratic Women's Committee, and the Republican Women's Committee had all been at last united under the leadership of Miss Charles Williams, Vice Chairman of the National Democratic Committee. With all these influences on the side of ratification, and with a majority of the legislature pledged in writing to vote for ratification in the special session, the prospects to onlookers seemed uninterestingly obvious, and the effort to accumulate further evidence of demand for the Tennessee ratification appeared to them a senseless waste of energy. Yet experienced suffragists faced the coming events with anxiety, and each congressional chairman to whose workers the legislators' pledges had been made was urged to be present when the legislature met. On Saturday evening, August 7th, the great foyer of the Hermitage Hotel was packed with men and women bedecked with suffrage yellow and anti-suffrage red, and the War of the Roses was on. The anti-women had made an 11th-hour attempt to show numbers and had brought women from all parts of the country, especially from southern states. All the women who had become familiar figures in anti-suffrage contests were there, and many more. Mysterious men in great numbers were there, taking an active part in the controversy, while in and out, through this crowded third house, moved the bewildered legislators. End of Chapter 30, Part 1.
Chapter 30, Part 2 of Woman, Suffrage, and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Cassiopeia Sparks. Woman, Suffrage, and Politics. The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Shuler. Tennessee, Part 2. That very day, the ominous possibilities of the invisible government were made manifest. Seth Walker, Speaker of the House, who had willingly joined the Men's Ratification Committee, and had not only pledged his vote verbally and in writing to several persons, but had accepted the invitation to introduce the resolution, sought out the president of the League of Women Voters and announced a change of mind. By evening it had become clear that he would assume the floor leadership against the amendment. Before midnight, suffragists had other worries. During the evening, groups of legislators under escort of strange men had left the foyer and gone to a room on the 8th floor. As the evening grew late, legislators, both suffrage and anti-suffrage men, were reeling through the hall in a state of advanced intoxication, a sight no suffragist had before witnessed in his 60 years of suffrage struggle. Sunday passed, and Monday, August 9th, came. The legislature met at noon. The governor's message recommending ratification was delivered, and both houses adjourned for the day. With nothing to do, members again accepted the invitation to the 8th floor, where a group of anti-suffrage men dispensed old bourbon and moonshine whiskey with lavish insistence. Tennessee had been a prohibition state before the 18th Amendment had been submitted, and the state had also ratified that amendment. Why was not the law enforced? Asked the women. Now see here, was the answer. In Tennessee, whiskey and legislation go hand in hand, especially when controversial questions are urged. Denial of this traditional license when a great issue was at stake would be resented as an interference with established custom by suffragists and anti-suffragists. This is the Tennessee way. Suffragists were plunged into helpless despair. Hour by hour, suffrage men and women who went to the different hotels of the city to talk with the legislators came back to the Hermitage headquarters to report. And every report told the same story. The legislature was drunk. How many legislators? Was the abashed query. No one knew. "Are none sober?" was next asked. "Possibly," was the answer. In agony of soul, suffragists went to bed in the early morning, but not to sleep. The members of the Tennessee legislature, however, largely slept themselves sober during the night, and hope revived. Presiding Officer Todd introduced the resolution in the Senate on the 10th, according to agreement, and the entire Shelby County delegation introduced it in the House. At the request of the Antis, the Senate and House committees to which the resolution had been referred granted a hearing on the evening of the 12th. Meantime, the opponents tested their strength in the House by introducing a resolution referring the amendment to county conventions in order to hear from the people. Suffrage legislators promptly tabled it by a vote of 50 to 37. The suffrage men also tabled another resolution declaring ratification of any amendment in that session to be in violation of the spirit of the state constitution. One of the largest crowds ever assembled in the Capitol attended the suffrage hearing. The suffragists entrusted their side to a group of brilliant and distinguished Tennessee lawyers. The evening furnished the suffrage side with two disagreeable surprises. Major Stallman of the Nashville Banner, who had faithfully promised support to suffragists at the Kiwanis Club, spoke for the Antis. Later it was learned that he had assumed direction of the opposition lobby. His sudden change of position was regarded as another ominous sign. The other incident that startled the suffragists was this. A man arose and read a letter from presidential candidate Harding. "I beg to acknowledge your esteemed favor of August 4th. Your letter is the first bit of information I have had concerning the provision in your state constitution. I have heard something about a constitutional inhibition against your legislature acting upon the federal amendment, but I did not know of the explicit provision to which your letter makes reference. I quite agree with you that members of the General Assembly cannot ignore the state constitution. Without having seen the document myself, I should be reluctant to undertake to construe it. I have felt for some time that it would be very fortunate if we could dispose of the suffrage amendment, and I have done what I could, in a consistent way, to bring about the consummation of ratification. I have tried throughout it all to avoid trespassing upon the rights of state officials. It has not seemed to me a proper thing for a candidate on the federal ticket to assume an undue authority in directing state officials as to the performance of their constitutional duties. I did say, and I still believe it would be a fortunate thing for Republicans to play their full part in bringing about ratification. I should be very unfair to you, and should very much misrepresent my own convictions, if I urged you to vote for ratification when you hold to a very conscientious belief that there is a constitutional inhibition which prevents your doing so until after an election has been held. Italics ours. I hope I make myself reasonably clear on this subject. I do not want you to have any doubt about my belief in the desirability of completing the ratification, but I am just as earnest about expressing myself in favor of fidelity to conscience in the performance of a public service. Candidates Harding and Cox had both been fully informed of the alleged technical obstruction in the Tennessee Constitution and of the campaign among the lawyers of the state to offset it. In the flood of impressions circling around a presidential candidate, the explanation had apparently slipped away in Mr. Harding's case, and the effect of this letter upon the campaign was to hand a cudgel to the opponents. It opened the way for Republicans to creep out of their pledged obligations with a pose of extra conscientiousness, and for a return of the argument which had been largely eliminated by intensive effort. To watching suffragists, that letter came like a bolt from a blue sky, and again there was no sleep. The anxiety was stilled for a time by the prompt and generous act of the Tennessee Senate. The Senate committee met immediately after the hearing on the 12th and voted to report the amendment favorably by a vote of 8 to 2. the two dissenters made ready to present a minority report. Although the debate in the Senate on the 13th had been awaited with anxiety, only 2 speeches were made in opposition. One of these was so vituperative and vulgar that it not only aroused the fighting qualities of the friends of suffrage, but called forth denunciation from the entire state. Many were the letters of apology sent to suffrage headquarters from prominent men on behalf of the state for this attack upon individual suffragists. Senator Collins, who had been brought from a sickbed to cast his vote for ratification, stood tremblingly clinging to his desk, as with shaking voice he eloquently defended women against the attack. Senator Monroe, who was carried on the anti-poll, created a sensation when he announced that he had been reminded of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and requested in that connection by Northern women antis to vote against the amendment. "But," said he, "I am going to vote for ratification in order to give back to the North what the North gave to Tennessee when it ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments." Others, for various reasons, announced changes of attitude. The minority report was promptly rejected, and ratification passed August 13th, 25 ayes and 4 nays. To the outside world watching, this result was an expected and normal action. To the suffragists on guard in Tennessee, it meant a reversal of the usual policy. The opposition had centered on the House instead of the Senate. The political fate of the women of the nation now rested in the hands of a minority of a single legislative chamber. From day to day the House ominously postponed the date of the vote. Though the postponement meant that the pledged majority was still standing fast, in vain did the suffrage members try to get the resolution on the calendar. Meanwhile, the male anti-suffrage lobby, from early morning of each day until the wee small hours of the next, threatened and cajoled the embattled 62 who had signed pledges. They were baited with whiskey, tempted with offers of office, loans of money, and every other device which old hands at illicit politics could conceive or remember. An alleged attempt to kidnap a suffrage member was made. Various schemes were started to get rid of enough suffrage legislators to allow the opposition a chance to act, a favorite proposal being that men might conveniently get messages calling them home. Engaged in this nefarious intrigue was what old-timers recognized as the former whiskey lobby in full force, the one-time railroad lobby, which was alleged to have directed Tennessee politics for years, and a newer manufacturer's lobby. All pretense was thrown aside, and all three worked openly as one man, although who paid the bills the public never knew. Every day men dropped from the poll. In some cases the actual consideration was noised about. One man, who had written 9 letters in which he declared that he would be on hand to vote for women's suffrage until I am called up yonder, had fallen early. Before the end, all men checked as bribable on the poll, taken before the legislature met, fell from it. The American Constitutional League, Everett P. Wheeler, president, formerly the Men's Anti-Suffrage League, formed a branch in Nashville, and its members, mainly politicians, joined in the bombardment of legislators friendly to suffrage. The Maryland legislature sent a memorial, which was read at the opening of the Tennessee legislature, urging rejection of ratification, and representatives of the Maryland League for State Defense, formerly the Men's Anti-Suffrage League of Maryland, joined the lobby. Women antis pressed the sharp point of Negro woman suffrage into Southern traditions. The men antis bore hard on the alleged illegalities of ratification by the Tennessee legislature. All of them quoted Mr. Harding's sympathy with the oath-violating theory. Men and women, as organized anti-suffragists, issued daily press bulletins assuming the responsibility for the campaign of opposition, while, as usual, other men, whose presence in Nashville was unannounced to the outside world, were applying the third degree in a hotel bedroom. The hotel committee met on the evening of the 16th and reported favorably on the 17th. The vote on the resolution having been set for that day, the debate was opened by T.K. Riddick of Memphis, Shelby County, a distinguished lawyer who had allowed himself to be elected to a vacancy for the sole purpose of aiding ratification. Said he, "I have in my pocket the pledges of 62 members of this House, which the people of Tennessee will have the opportunity to read. If those men fail to keep faith, I shall go from this chamber ashamed of being a Democrat, ashamed of being a Tennessean." Seth Walker made what the mountaineers called a bear-cat of a speech, saying that it had been charged that his change of attitude was due to a certain railroad which he named. This he resented, but he conspicuously failed to give an explanation of his strange volte-face, which was amazing the entire nation. The Antis brought the debate to a close by a motion to adjourn, passed by a vote of 52 to 44. The previous tests had indicated that suffragists were in control of the House, but this one gave evidence that the position had been reversed. Suffrage anxiety was intense. That night, the suffrage leaders with heavy hearts confessed their despair to each other. "There is one thing more we can do," said the president of the National Suffrage Association. "Only one. We can pray." In the interim, representatives of a group of newspapers called upon the governor and threatened to defeat him at the election if he did not pull off his men. He stood firm. On the 18th, the House was again packed, and hundreds of would-be onlookers were turned away. The debate continued. "What is a greater crime than for interests from New York to San Francisco to send lobbyists here to break your pledges, or for certain newspapers connected with railroads to threaten you, as they have been doing for the last 10 days?" demanded Joe Hanover, floor suffrage leader. L. D. Miller of Chattanooga closed with a ringing speech in which he said, "When the special interests made an attack on this legislature in January, they had a gang of lobbyists to put over their infamous bills. I recognize in the lobbies these same special interest servers. You have an opportunity on this occasion to rid this state of an incubus that has had its claws in this legislature for 50 years. Let us show by our votes that the special interests are done in Tennessee." The moment had become intensely dramatic. Every onlooker knew that the fate of the question might depend upon a single vote. Of the 99 elected members of the House, 96 were present. One had resigned, and his place was vacant. The other two, both suffragists, were kept at home by serious family illness. Dr. J. Frank Griffin had hastened home from California to cast a suffrage vote. R. L. Dowland, who had just undergone a serious operation, was brought from his bed to the Capitol to vote for the resolution. Seth Walker, in a last effort to rally the weakening lines of the anti-ratificationists, at the end of the debate, shouted in melodramatic manner, "The hour has come! The battle has been fought and won!" and moved to table the resolution. But the vote on tabling stood 48 to 48. The room rang with the cheers of the galleries. One more vote had been won for suffrage. The roll call showed that Banks Turner, who was carried on the anti-poll, had dropped into the suffrage column. Unwilling to believe the roll call, Mr. Walker demanded a second, and it was taken. He left his speaker's seat, and with arms thrown around Banks Turner, whispered insistent entreaties in his ears as the names were again called. Shivers ran down suffrage backs as Mr. Turner passed his call without response. Heads stretched forward, and every eye centered on the legislator and the speaker, while a breathless silence pervaded the room. The fans ceased to wave. Even the overpowering heat was forgotten. At the end of the roll call, Mr. Turner threw off the speaker's arm, drew himself up proudly, and shouted a defiant "No." Cheers and shouts burst forth again, and the galleries would accept no discipline from the chair. The vote still stood 48 to 48 against tabling. A motion to ratify the amendment was then made, and the vote was taken in a tension that was well nigh unbearable. 49 ayes, 47 nays. The House broke into an uproar, and the cheers of triumph that rang through the old legislative chamber were heard far down the street. The second additional vote that had been won for suffrage was that of Harry Byrne, a 24-year-old Republican, who forthwith became a hero to the suffragists and a traitor to their opponents. He had been placed on the suffrage poll as conditioned, for he had promised to vote for the resolution only if his vote should be necessary for ratification, otherwise he was going to vote against it, as he believed his constituents were opposed. From the vote on the motion to table, he saw that his vote was necessary, and so changed his attitude on the ratification motion. Although 49 was a majority of 96, the number of members present, and sufficient for legal ratification, Tennessee was accustomed to consider 50 the majority of 99, the total elected membership, as a constitutional majority. Seth Walker, in order to move a reconsideration, changed his vote from no to aye, which made the final record 50 ayes to 46 nays, thus giving the constitutional majority. Thus, by a freak of politics, the last vote needed by the Tennessee Standard to enfranchise the women of a great nation was cast by a man who was clearly staking heavily to defeat it. According to the printed rules of the House in Tennessee, a motion to reconsider any ordinary measure may be made by any person voting on the majority side, and that person controls the right to bring the motion up at any time within 3 days. No other person may bring it up. On each of these 3 days, the House met with full quorum present, but the Speaker did not bring up his motion to reconsider. The 2 suffrage absentees had returned, and there were suffrage votes to spare. During that 3 days period, the opposition again worked desperately. One suffrage member was called every half hour through 2 nights, each time with a different appeal to change his vote. Another was urged every half hour all night to come downtown to see an important man. A man who was laboring day and night in the midst of the anti-forces to break the suffrage majority finally implored his daughter-in-law to renounce publicly the suffrage side and come out in opposition. With tears in his eyes, he entreated, "It will mean a great deal to you and your daughter in the future if this amendment is defeated." Whereupon the spirited 17-year-old daughter present at the interview spoke for her mother. "Mother and I would rather live in poverty all the rest of our lives than get money by treachery to our sex. We will not desert the suffragists, and we are not proud of the work you are doing." A man who was carried on the suffrage poll was reported by suffrage men as wavering, and was boldly claimed by the opposition. A confession was secured by U.S. Senator McKellar that he had been offered a position under the Excise Commissioner for his vote. A telegram to the President of the United States brought prompt rebuke to the commissioner, who left town at once, and the man ceased to waver. Young Harry Byrne was the chief object of persecution. He was threatened with exposure of an alleged bribe if he did not remain out of the legislature until the vote on reconsideration was over. Men declared they had affidavits to prove that he had been bribed by suffrage floor leader Hanover and the governor's secretary between the vote on tabling and that on ratification. The presentation of affidavits disproved that charge. The efforts at intimidation led Mr. Byrne to make a statement to the House. "I desire to resent, in the name of honesty and justice, the veiled intimation and accusation regarding my vote on the suffrage amendment, as indicated in certain statements, and it is my sincere belief that those responsible for their existence know there is not a scintilla of truth in them. I want to state that I changed my vote in favor of ratification first because I believe in full suffrage as a right. Second, I believe we had a moral and legal right to ratify. Third, I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for her boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. Fourth, I appreciated the fact that an opportunity such as seldom comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine. Fifth, I desired that my party in both state and nation might say that it was a Republican from the East Mountains of Tennessee, the purest Anglo-Saxon section in the world, who made national women's suffrage possible at this date, not for personal glory, but for the glory of his party. A few hours later, the president of the League of Women Voters received a telegram from Mrs. J. L. Byrne, the young man's mother. The telegram read, "Woman was here today, claims to be wife of Governor of Louisiana, and secured an interview with me, and tried by every means to get me to refute and say that the letter I sent to my son was false. The letter is authentic, and was written by me, and you can refute any statement that any party claims to have received from me. Any statement claiming to be from me is false. I stand squarely behind suffrage, and request my son to stick to suffrage until the end. This woman was very insulting to me in my home, and I had a hard time to get her out of my home." An amusing indication of the state of suffrage nerves occurred when during this 3-day period Harry Byrne was reported as having left Nashville. His hotel said he had gone, and the clerks did not know where. There was consternation again among the suffrage forces. Had he deserted after all? Had he been kidnapped? An hour later his name appeared upon the register of another hotel to which he had moved. Men were found listening at the transoms of suffrage doors. A telegram between the receiving and operating telephone desk was stolen and given to the press. Men, whom nobody seemed to know or what they represented, mysteriously appeared and joined the opposition forces. All day and all night suffrage lines were guarded. Suffrage women picketed the hotel floors where suspicious incidents had taken place, and suffrage men polled the suffrage members every 2 hours during the day, and watched over them at night. On the 18th, the opposition held a mass meeting where 2 things of note occurred. In a speech, Seth Walker confidently announced that 3 men had deserted the suffrage side, and that in consequence, the defeat of the amendment was certain. The other incident was a letter from presidential candidate Cox, surprisingly similar to that of Mr. Harding, and dated on the same day. More doubt and confusion. Again, the public did not know whether to believe that the 2 candidates were playing politics, or were sincere in their desire to see the amendment ratified, and the opposition made the most of the situation. Again, the oath-loyalty argument was revived and made to work. Could it be true that 3 men had deserted? Suffragists asked. Faithful suffrage men did not sleep until they had sounded every pledged man, and when they found the sterling 49 still standing firm, they recorded Seth Walker's claim as a political bluff. The vote on reconsideration was expected hourly on Friday, and the galleries were again packed. A manufacturer had given a holiday to his women employees, and sent them red rose bedecked to help fill the galleries and swell the anti-numbers. It was clear that every vote might be needed. T.A. Dodson had received a message that his baby was dying, and had just taken his train when it was discovered that his vote might prove crucial. A suffragist drove her motor on a flying trip to the station, taking 2 suffrage men with her. They reached the train just as it was moving out, and the men promised the legislator a special train which would get him home as soon as the regular one, if he would come back. He returned, remaining while needed, was given the special train, paid for by Newell Sanders, a Republican and ex-state senator, and reached home to find the baby happily recovering. The hours passed. The quorum was present. The suffrage voters were all there. But Mr. Walker, perceiving the futility of so doing, did not bring up his motion to reconsider. At the end of the session, the suffrage majority carried a motion to meet on Saturday morning, the 21st. According to the custom, but not the printed rules of the House, it was possible after the 3 days for any member to call up a motion to reconsider, and the suffrage members intended to bring it up on Saturday morning and vote it down. The city of Nashville looked forward to another exciting session, but before Saturday's breakfast, the news was all about town that 38 anti-ratification House members had ignominiously fled in the dead of night. They had gone in small groups to a station near Nashville, where they boarded an L&N train, which carried them across the border into Alabama. This move of last resort was intended to prevent any further action by destroying a quorum and to give time to anti-suffrage workers to break down a suffrage member. The House met on Saturday morning with 50 suffrage men and 9 antis present, and with women suffragists occupying the seats of the absentees. The anti-suffrage chaplain added a bit of irony to the situation when he prayed that God's richest blessings be granted our absent ones. The suffrage garrison prepared to enjoy itself, and harassed Speaker Walker by overturning every ruling and voting down every decision of the chair. Speaker Walker announced that an injunction against forwarding the certificate of ratification to Washington had been issued that morning by Judge Langford of the Supreme Court, and that the injunction had been served upon the Governor, the Secretary of State, and the Speaker of both houses. The ratificationists went on with the legislative program. The pending motion to reconsider was called up and voted down. The ratified amendment was ordered returned to the Senate, and it was returned. It was common knowledge that the governor could not be enjoined by the laws of the state, and lawyers now begged him to ignore the injunction and forward the certificate. But the governor was non-committal, while neither the Attorney General nor any of his assistants could be located. The Attorney General's office mysteriously professed no knowledge of their whereabouts. After 2 days' absence, however, Attorney General Thompson emerged from his hiding place, brief in hand, supporting a plea which was heard by Judge Lansdowne, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, on August 23rd. The plea was for a writ of certiorari et supersedious, and it was issued, thus dissolving the injunction of the lower court, and clearing the way for the Tennessee certificate to be sent to Washington. During this time, the Attorney General issued 2 opinions which were seconded through the press by many other equally prominent lawyers throughout the state. 1. When a legislature has taken favorable action on a federal amendment, it has exhausted its power to act, and no motion to reconsider is applicable even for the limit of 3 days. 2. Had a motion to reconsider been applicable in the case of a federal suffrage amendment, that power was exhausted according to the printed rules of the House when 3 days had passed, for no contrary custom of the House could be held to have legal value. On Tuesday, August 24th, at 10:17 a.m., Governor Roberts, in the presence of interested suffragists, signed the certificate and sent it by registered mail to the Secretary of State. It was delivered at 4 a.m. on the 26th, and was at once referred for examination to the solicitor who had been sitting up all night in order to be on hand when it should arrive. An open threat to secure an injunction to prevent the issuance of the proclamation certifying to the ratification of the amendment had been continually made by the opposition. In July, Justice Bailey of the District of Columbia Supreme Court had declined to issue such an injunction upon action brought by Charles S. Fairchild and the American Constitutional League. On August 25th, Justice Siddons of the same court had refused the same application. The Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby, however, took no chances, and arose early on the morning of the 26th. At 8 o'clock, without ceremony, he signed the proclamation. The group of workers of the National Suffrage Association, returning from Tennessee, arrived in Washington the morning the proclamation was signed, and found a great victory celebration awaiting them. In the evening, to a packed theater audience, they told the story of the Tennessee campaign. The Secretary of State was there to represent the administration, and on behalf of the nation congratulated the suffragists upon their freedom. On August 27th, the Tennessee suffrage group returned to New York City, the home of the National Suffrage headquarters. The governor of the state and representatives of the Republican and Democratic national committees were at the station to welcome them, and so were the Old Guard suffragists. With the 71st Regiment Band at the head, and with the old familiar banners waving, they marched together for the last time to the Waldorf Astoria, where all made speeches of self-congratulation. Mrs. Harriet Taylor Upton, national chairman of the Republican women, told how the Republicans carried Tennessee, and Miss Charles Williams, national chairman of the Democratic women, told how the Democrats did it. Others told how resourceful and fearless the Tennessee women had been, how heroic were the faithful 49 in the midst of the whirlwind of opposition, and how the victory was everybody's victory who had labored in the cause. A hurry call had been sent to all the mayors of Tennessee, urging them to join the women's celebration by ordering the ringing of bells and blowing of whistles. And the whistles did blow, and the bells did ring merrily and sincerely in most Tennessee towns, for the people in the main stood by the ratifying legislature. From ocean to ocean, from Canada to the Gulf, the celebrations continued. Meetings, processions, flag-raisings, transformations from suffrage associations into leagues of women voters were the order of the day for the month that followed. None was more significant than the draped flag over the tablet that marked the site of the chapel where the world's first women's convention had been held in 1848, in Geneva, New York. None more significant than the wreaths of flowers hung on the old building where the world's first women's jury had sat in 1870 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Here the story of women's suffrage in the United States should appropriately end. But there was more to come, and come in Tennessee, before the long suffrage campaign was permitted to pass into history as a closed issue. The Tennessee legislature recessed from day to day, as there was no quorum. The call had included 132 bills as needing attention by the legislature. The majority of the anti-ratificationists stubbornly remained in Alabama or at their homes and awaited the call of their masters. The ratification members, unwilling to remain in Nashville without a quorum, had gone home also. Anti-ratification mass meetings were still in progress, and the speakers were defiantly threatening to undo ratification in the courts. Meanwhile, the governor and the sergeant-at-arms were striving to get a quorum of the legislature. It was publicly announced that on August 30th, the Red Rose Brigade would return. 4 hours were spent on that day in an effort to secure the quorum of 66 members, but at no time could more than 63 be found. The filibusters had returned with a great show of being ready for business. The full suffrage majority was not in Nashville, and the ratificationists who were there feared to help compose a quorum lest some unfriendly act be passed. Ratification legislators, arrested and brought into the House, escaped by other doors, while the 46 anti-ratificationists held their seats. Finally, it was announced that the ratificationists would all be in their seats on the 31st, whereupon the antis failed to appear, lest they could not muster a sufficient vote to overthrow the suffrage action of August 21st. The scene had lost its attraction for both suffragists and anti-suffragists, who now deserted the balconies. Without the yellow and the red, the place looked lonesome. Even Mr. Walker absented himself on this date. On September 11th, however, the anti-ratificationists won the game of hide-and-seek and got control of the House, many suffrage men being absent. Amid shouts of glee, by a vote of 47 to 37, they passed a motion to expunge from the record all that had taken place on the 21st, except the record that there had been no quorum. Mr. Riddick, on behalf of the ratificationists, contested every step with points of order. The entire controversy raged around the question of a quorum. By the rules of the legislature, 2/3, 66 of the elected number constituted a quorum in the House. There was a quorum when the House ratified. There was a majority, but not a quorum, by Tennessee rules, when the House voted down the motion to reconsider and returned the ratified amendment to the Senate. Mr. Riddick contended that the authority for procedure was drawn from the federal Constitution and that no rules of the House could supersede. He claimed that the authority for a quorum composed of a majority was drawn from parliamentary usage. In these views he was sustained by the Attorney General, whose opinion he quoted. The anti-members refused to accept this interpretation. A resolution to reject the suffrage amendment as a substitute for the one to ratify, which the antis held to be pending on reconsideration, was voted on, 47 to 24, with 20 not voting. This rejection resolution was sent to the Senate with instructions that it be forwarded to the governor. The suffrage House members now enjoined the chief clerk of the Senate from receiving it. On September 12th, the Senate was in a turmoil of indignation as it discussed the resolution received from the House and resented attempts to control its business. By a vote of 17 to 8, it refused to accept the resolution and returned that message, whereupon House members volubly informed senators that if their resolution was not received, there would be no passage by the House of the per diem for senators, nor other Senate legislation. The threats proved persuasive, and on September 13th, the Senate, having turned a somersault overnight, accepted the resolution by a vote of 21 to 4. Then the Senate forwarded the resolution of rejection to the governor, who in turn sent it to the Secretary of State. With the suffrage question thus disposed of to the satisfaction of each contending faction, the legislature settled down to business, and remained in session until September 6th, when it adjourned after passing, over the governor's veto, the appropriation bill, which gave to each member $100 extra for expenses incurred in remaining longer than the 20 days of the special session allowed by the Constitution. Although the laws of the state of Tennessee declare desertion of a legislative post to be a felony, this law was not enforced, and the fleeing opposition members of the House drew their per diem and extra allowances without protest. On September 12th, Speaker Walker and a group of anti-men appeared in Washington to entreat the Secretary to withdraw the proclamation. Failing in their mission, they went on to Connecticut with the avowed purpose of persuading the political group which had so stubbornly resisted all efforts to secure a special session in that state to continue that policy in order that the legality of the ratification of the amendment might rest upon the case of Tennessee. They returned to Washington and again sought an interview with the Secretary of State in order to renew their appeal. Interviews in the press widely announced that they had not surrendered and would contest the ratification of Tennessee in the courts. The American Constitutional League, formerly the Men's Anti-Woman Suffrage League, and the Maryland League for State Defense, formerly the Maryland Men's Anti-Suffrage Association, were still declaring through numerous press communications that ratification would be proved invalid. The women antis still continued their publicity service, announcing with frequency that litigation would be started not only to invalidate the amendment, but the entire presidential election. None of the threatened litigation alarmed the nation, but it doubtless served to convince political leaders that another state was desirable to make assurance doubly sure. Governor Holcomb of Connecticut, although still unyielding, now called a special session to provide for registering women. When calling it, he warned the legislators that they must confine themselves to the business contained in the call, and omitted the suffrage amendment from the list. No such restriction had ever been put upon the Connecticut legislature, and the governor himself had said 2 years before that he had no power to prevent the transaction of any business when once the legislature had been called in special session. The members, a majority of whom had long been pledged to ratification, determined to show independence and to ratify. As soon as the special session opened, Governor Holcomb appeared and asked that it adjourn without action, as it was his intention to issue another call to meet a week later to ratify the amendment and to enact other necessary legislation. Both houses refused, and by unanimous vote in the Senate, and with only 11 voting in opposition in the House, ratified the federal suffrage amendment, even though the governor had failed to transmit the certified copy. In further defiance of the governor, they passed several bills, none of which was included in the call. They then adjourned until September 21st. When the legislature again met, the governor appeared and asked the members to ratify the amendment. Many refused, as it seemed an acknowledgment that their former action was invalid. But reason conquered tempers, and as the Connecticut Auxiliary to the National Suffrage Association strongly recommended a second action to make legality absolutely certain, the amendment was again ratified. The same day, to placate the members who wished the first record to stand, a motion was made to reconsider and confirm the action of the first session. Thus terminated a continuous struggle of 15 months to secure ratification from a legislature which all that time had been ready to act favorably, and which finally ratified the amendment not once, but 3 times. The ratification of Connecticut stilled any restless questioning of the validity of Tennessee, and forever established the amendment as a part of the federal Constitution. Governor Clement of Vermont retired from office December 31st, 1920, and was succeeded by Governor James Harkness. The Vermont legislature met in regular session in January 1921. The resolution to ratify the federal suffrage amendment was read in the House for the 3rd time on January 28 and passed ayes 202, nays 3. On February 8, it was passed unanimously by the Senate. The threats of the Tennessee Antis had died of inattention, and the threatened invalidation of the amendment had by now narrowed down to 2 cases. One, the Lesser v. Garnett case, claiming that 36 states had not legally ratified the amendment, the ratifications of West Virginia, Missouri, and Tennessee being cited as invalid, brought a decision from the Maryland Court of Common Pleas that 36 had duly ratified. The case was carried to the Court of Appeals, Maryland, where on June 28, 1921, the judge affirmed the decision of the lower court that these ratifications were valid. It was then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, where a decision sustaining the 2 prior opinions was handed down. The other, a similar contention, known as the Fairchild case, which had been pending in different forms since July 1920, was also dismissed by the Supreme Court of the United States. Thus, all efforts to declare the amendment invalid came to an end. The final announcement of these decisions appeared in small paragraphs in obscure corners of the newspapers. Hardly anyone noted them. Women's suffrage was already everywhere recognized as an established fact. End of Chapter 30, Part 2. Recording by Cassiopeia Sparks.
Chapter 31, Part 1 of Woman Suffrage and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Women's Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Shuler. The states that did not ratify. It is doubtful if any man, even among suffrage men, ever realized what the suffrage struggle came to mean to women before the end was allowed in America. How much of time and patience, how much work, energy, and aspiration, how much faith, how much hope, how much despair went into it. It leaves its mark on one such a struggle. It fills the days and it rides the nights. Working, eating, drinking, sleeping, it is there. Not all women in all the states of the Union were in the struggle. There were some women in every state who knew nothing about it, but most women in all the states were at least on the periphery of its effort and interest when they were not in the heart of it. To them, all its success became a monumental thing. The action of their respective legislatures in ratifying the federal suffrage amendment was greeted by the women of every state with a vast state pride and gratification because that Commonwealth stood forth before the world as an upholder of the American ideal of democracy. To the women of 10 states of the Union, this pride and gratification were denied. The men of 10 states left it to the generosity of the men of other states to enfranchise their own wives, mothers, sisters, daughters. One of the 10 was Delaware, the only one north of the Mason and Dixon line. The other 9 were Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. In preceding pages, it has been set forth that the original plan of the opposition was to secure 13 refusals to ratify. This was later modified into a plan to secure the adoption of forthright rejection resolutions in 13 states. If this had proved successful, it would have been next in order to ask for a proclamation of defeat. By the use of this rejection resolution, it was hoped, too, to raise the question whether a succeeding legislature could adopt an amendment that the preceding legislature had formally rejected. The rejection resolution read, "Resolved by the General Assembly of the State of the House and the Senate concurring that the proposed amendment to the Constitution of the United States be, and hereby is, rejected as an unwarranted, unnecessary, undemocratic, and dangerous interference with the rights reserved to the states or to the people in both state and federal constitutions, and be it further resolved that a copy of this resolution be filed with the Secretary of the United States as the expressed will of the people of, as registered in their Constitution and by their elected representatives in the General Assembly, to retain the fundamental rights of local self-government vested in the states or in the people, and be it further resolved that we call upon our sister states of the Union to uphold and defend the right of each state to decide who shall vote for its own officers, and to oppose and reject any amendment to the Constitution of the United States that would transfer control of state franchises to the federal Congress without the consent of the people themselves, as duly exercised under their several state constitutions." The resolution used was practically the same in all states except that the words unwarranted, unnecessary, undemocratic, and dangerous were used interchangeably. The keynote of the opposition that was to be directed against ratification of the federal suffrage amendment by the Southern states had been struck as early as June 10, 1919, just 6 days after the submission of the amendment, in a statement issued by Senator Lee S. Overman of North Carolina. The prominence of Senator Overman in administration councils, his long service in the Senate, and his prestige throughout the South made an indelible impression upon those to whom his message was directed. "In my opinion," said he, "the woman suffrage amendment just adopted by Congress is a reaffirmation of the 15th Amendment. I wonder if this is appreciated throughout the South. This latter amendment simply goes a step further than the 15th Amendment. In addition to saying that the right of suffrage shall not be abridged by reason of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the new amendment adds the word sex. The language is not identical, but it is evident that the woman suffrage resolution is a postscript to the former amendment, which we have always opposed in the South. The illiterate colored woman, for instance, irrespective of her non-conception of the duties of citizenship, may vote and pair with the most intelligent woman of the Caucasian race. Congress reserves the right of appropriate legislation to enforce this mandate regardless of the state. That is the condition in a nutshell. I wonder if woman suffrage advocates in the South have taken into consideration all the embarrassing features possible under such legislation. Through the years since the force bill had ceased to be operative, there had been talk of its revival, and the dread of that possibility ever hung over the heads of Southern legislators like the sword of Damocles. Coincident with the passage of the federal woman suffrage amendment had come the demand for self-determination on the part of the black people of the Southern states. A dispatch from Paris the last week of June 1919 had carried the story of the appearance there of an American Negro, William Trotter, who was seeking to have the Negro question taken up by the peace conference along with the Irish, Jewish, and other racial questions. This demand created a further disturbance in the minds of representatives from Southern states. There was also the occasional question whether Southern representation in Congress should be reduced in accord with the federal Constitution. There had been threats of this in political conventions. Threats might become an actuality. Damaging figures could be arrayed against the South. In 1916, 159,749 votes cast in Georgia elected 12 members of Congress, while 999,781 votes in California elected 11 members of Congress. In other words, 13,312 votes in Georgia had as much power as 90,889 votes in California. Spread out on the record, this precarious position of justice in the South was a menace to the whole Democratic Party at each election. The leaders of that party were not blind to the danger. Every effort was made by them to persuade Southern legislatures to ratify the federal suffrage amendment. They prophesied that the rejection of the amendment in these states not only meant certain defeat for the Democratic Party at the polls in 1920, but that the hostility of Northern women voters might be aroused to the extent of insisting on enforcing the 15th Amendment with all the horror of racial strife and loss of self-government. President Wilson wired the governors of all the Southern states urging ratification from the viewpoint of expediency and warning them that the National Democratic Party's success was at stake. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, and the chairman of the National Democratic Committee, Homer Cummings, also sent urgent requests to party leaders and to members of the legislatures. The only outcome was the condemnation of the president, who was called a meddler, and resentment against the national chairman for what was termed outside interference. The press in many of the Southern states was favorable. It scored the legislators for their ignorance and unprogressiveness. The press of Savannah, Georgia, said, "The majority of the legislature is opposed to suffrage. Of course, we can't blame them for that. The fault is not theirs that their intellects are limited or their consciences dwarfed. We, the people, have elected them. We are to blame, not they. No rational person hopes to defeat the amendment. All that can possibly be done is to write down Georgia as one of the few, if not the only state that opposes right and justice with her own feeble bulk." Georgia, the Empire State of the South, as she is self-styled, was the first to reject the federal suffrage amendment. In well-informed circles, there was no great surprise over this action. Before the session convened, members of the Georgia Auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association and their friends in the legislature realized the impossibility of ratification and decided to wait a year in the hope of a growing suffrage sentiment. Usually when the advocates of a measure withhold it, the opponents make no objection. Not so in Georgia. The opposition introduced ratification resolutions in Senate and House for the announced purpose of defeating them. Never in any legislative body have the opponents of a measure shown themselves so bloodthirsty and vindictive, declared a representative on the floor. In both houses these resolutions were referred to the committees on constitutional amendments, one of which had 5 bills proposing to amend the state constitution so as to enfranchise women, on which no action had ever been taken. When the joint hearing was held, a rejection resolution was substituted. In both committees, the vote was unfavorable to suffrage. In the Senate, the report was unexpectedly called a few days later, and a motion to disagree with the committee report was lost. As ratification was considered hopeless, friends in the Senate attempted to postpone action indefinitely by a filibuster which lasted for several days and was the means of recommitting the entire suffrage question to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments, with the understanding that it would remain there the balance of the session. But July 24, the same day that this agreement was made, a rejection resolution was introduced in the Senate, reported favorably by the committee, and after several hours' debate was carried. The Senate also voted down a proposition to submit a suffrage amendment to the state constitution. On the same day, the rejection resolution was carried in the House. During the debate in the Senate, a bitter attack was made on the amendment with many acrimonious and personal references. It was called a vicious piece of legislation. Susan B. Anthony was declared the worst enemy the South ever had. One senator affirmed, "We opponents of the amendment are trying to save the women of Georgia from a repetition of Reconstruction days. It is not a question of women's suffrage, but of protecting Georgia womanhood." Another said it would deprive the South of every right to control its own suffrage and place it forever under the dominant North. He cared not what position the Democratic Party took in the matter. He would insist on Georgia recording what she believed to be a vital matter of right, even if her action ends the life of what was once the Democratic Party. Still another said women should not be allowed to vote. Their privilege and obligation is to bear children. The sole intent of this voting privilege is to equalize white women with Negro women. These suffragists, men and women, are out with a propaganda for race suicide. Women are now refusing to bear children because of the policy of women's suffrage. Women who vote came here to induce Georgia women to refuse to bear children, which was the sole aim and end for having women at all, according to Bible doctrine. In the House, the final period of debate was one of the most tempestuous since the Reconstruction days. At times there were a dozen representatives on their feet at the same time, clamoring for recognition. The grant of unanimous consent gave opportunity for a parliamentary battle exceeding in interest anything that the Georgia legislature had ever indulged in. During the debate, one proponent of suffrage said, "I heard it stated that a very high official in the Democratic Party in this state has publicly announced that if the suffrage is given to women, he will quit the party. But where will he go? The Republicans are for it. The Socialists stand upon it. Even the Bolsheviks are on this platform. If we take the wings of the morning and fly to the uttermost parts of the earth, we will find it in Russia, in Germany, in England, in Scandinavia, in Switzerland, and the islands of the sea. It would be interesting to see the eminent gentleman like Noah's dove, finding no place for his foot till with wearied wing he comes back to the ark of his fathers." Both Senate and House passed resolutions rejecting the suffrage amendment, the subject matter of both being practically the same, but neither resolution was passed by both houses. As there was no joint resolution, no resolution ever reached the governor, so the action was null and void. By overreaching itself, Georgia's virulence was officially as if it had not been. If the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House had been less anxious to send the official notice of the rejection of the federal suffrage amendment to the Congress, they might have remembered that they had failed to sign a joint resolution. According to one newspaper, Alabama craved the privilege of being first to reject the federal suffrage amendment without a technicality. She was. From the beginning of the ratification campaign, there was evidence of a determination on the part of Alabama's United States senators that the adverse vote they had registered against the federal suffrage amendment in Washington should be vindicated by their state legislature. The defeat of ratification in Alabama can, therefore, be laid squarely at the door of the Democratic Senators Oscar W. Underwood and John H. Bankhead. Governor Kilby and Lieutenant Governor Nathan L. Miller both maintained neutral attitudes. The liquor opposition worked openly. The national Democratic leaders urged ratification on the grounds of party expediency, all the more because the Republicans were claiming credit for 9 of the 11 ratifications already secured at that time. The State Democratic Committee, 20-13, adopted a resolution which read, "We pledge our support in every proper way to accomplish the result desired." But the opposition machine was well oiled, and not a cog in a single wheel failed to turn. Governor Kilby transmitted the resolution without recommendation. By joint resolution, the Senate and House were to act simultaneously on July 17, but the House broke the agreement and the Senate alone took action. After defeating a motion to defer action and one to postpone indefinitely, the Senate passed a resolution to reject the amendment. The women hoped for postponement in the House, as the rejection resolution carried the provision that a message should be sent to the Federal Secretary of State, the President of the Senate, and Speaker of the House before the state of Alabama could be recorded as rejecting the amendment. On August 13, the Republican minority in the legislature, 5 members in the House and 1 in the Senate, issued a statement declaring that they intended to vote in favor of ratification in accordance with the mandate from their party. But on September 2, the Senate defeated the ratification resolution, and on the 17th, the House adopted the rejection resolution. No one had expected Mississippi to ratify, though members of the Mississippi Auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association pointed to the statement of Senator John Sharp Williams as indicating encouragement. He favored a white woman's primary, in which the women of the state might say whether they wanted the ballot or not. He was inclined to woman suffrage and thought that with safeguards it might be made a bulwark of white supremacy in the state. There was also the favorable attitude of state officials. Retiring Governor Theodore G. Bilbo had replied to Governor Byrne of Minnesota when he took the poll of governors that the Mississippi legislature would be called in the autumn, and he expected ratification. His farewell message, delivered in person, closed with the words, "Woe to that man who raises his hand against the onward march of this progressive movement." The newly elected governor, Lee M. Russell, in his inaugural address, January 20, devoted more time to the question of ratification than to any other topic. Mississippi women argued that their legislators could not consistently urge states' rights as a reason for not ratifying, because the same legislators had ratified the Prohibition Amendment in 15 minutes' time, and the same principle was involved. They did not know the elasticity of a Mississippi legislator's logic. The men who did not hesitate to ratify a federal amendment under which it was made a crime for a man to buy a bottle of beer in New York refused to ratify a federal amendment which placed the white women of their state on the same constitutional level as the colored men. Without warning to the friends of suffrage, a rejection resolution was offered in the House on January 21. It was not referred to a committee but rushed to a vote, and amid cheers and laughter, after 10 minutes' debate, it was carried. The resolution was sent to the Senate, and by it referred to the Committee on Constitution. A new resolution ratifying the amendment was then presented and failed of adoption. Then the rejection resolution was recommitted to the Constitution Committee, where it rested until March 30, when in Committee of the Whole a ratification resolution was substituted. The vote in the Senate was ayes 22, nays 22, Lieutenant Governor H. Castile breaking the tie and casting an affirmative vote. News of this favorable action spread all over the country, and the suffrage center of interest was suddenly shifted from Republican Delaware to Democratic Mississippi. Telegrams came pouring into Mississippi, offering congratulations and appealing to the House to make Mississippi the 36th state. When the substitute resolution to ratify was presented to the House the next day, March 31, a motion was made that the House do not concur with the Senate resolution of ratification. Hoots, catcalls, and jeers drowned the words of speakers. In the midst of the confusion, calls for the vote became loud and insistent. The author of 3 state suffrage bills introduced at this session attempted to speak against ratification. Representative R.H. Watts of Rankin County interpolated, "I would rather die and go to hell than vote for woman's suffrage," and the press said the boys cheered nearly a minute. The substitute resolution was read at 3 o'clock. At 3:15 the vote had been taken. The resolution to ratify announced as defeated, and the clerk was reading another bill. A curious incident of the suffrage action in Mississippi was that the legislature later passed bills making provision for the women to vote in primary and general elections, both contingent upon the ratification of the federal suffrage amendment. The same legislature passed a suffrage referendum bill, which was voted on in November 1920 after the enfranchisement of women, and received ayes 39,186, nays 24,296. Even in Mississippi, the people were for suffrage, more than 3-2, but the bill was not adopted, as the law requires a majority, not a plurality, of all the votes cast on an amendment. By then, however, women had already been enfranchised under the federal suffrage amendment. Unfortunately for Southern women, the state law in Mississippi required registration 4 months, and in Georgia 6 months before election. Since ratification was not completed until August 1920, the women in these two states were barred from voting in 1920, the only states where women were not allowed to participate in the election. South Carolina women had no illusions about ever securing the vote from South Carolina men through ratification or otherwise. Their experience in 1917 with a state referendum bill, defeated by the Senate and withdrawn at the women's request from the House because they knew it would fail, had given them a realization that their legislators did not favor votes for women by any method whatsoever. One newspaper made it plain from the beginning that the electorate and the General Assembly of South Carolina representing it will never vote for women's suffrage for no better reason than that other states vote for it, nor will the state be governed by the exigencies of the National Democratic Party or any other party when it considers the matter of limiting or expanding its electorate. On January 14, 1920, the joint resolution to ratify was introduced and referred to the Judiciary Committee, which reported it unfavorably. In the House on January 22, a concurrent resolution to reject the amendment was carried. This House action of voting on a measure without referring it to a committee or placing it on the calendar was unprecedented. In debate, a speaker wanted a joint resolution which will kill the infernal thing now and forever. Another said he had told some of the women lobbyists that more hell and the devil would be raised over this thing than anything else. On January 29, the rejection resolution was carried in the Senate. The Virginia legislature assembled on August 13, 1919, in special session, and the federal suffrage amendment was submitted by the governor without recommendation. As the session was called specifically for good roads, and as answers to a questionnaire submitted to members showed that it would be impossible to obtain ratification, the Virginia Auxiliary of the National American Woman Suffrage Association intended to wait for the regular session of 1920 to press for action. However, the opponents of suffrage hurried through a rejection proposal in the House without debate 10 minutes before the 1919 adjournment. The Senate voted to postpone action until the next session. In 1920, conditions in Virginia were not greatly improved, for although there were 61 new members in the two houses who had been elected since the last legislature, it was acknowledged to be not only a reactionary, but a very wet body. These men resented the ratification of the Prohibition Amendment, and it had crystallized their sentiment against the approval of any federal legislation. The Federal Relations Committee reported in favor of the rejection resolution. In both Senate and House, a ratification resolution and another to refer ratification to the voters were substituted for the rejection resolution. In the Senate, on February 6, after a debate of 12 hours, the rejection resolution was adopted by a vote of 24-10, and on February 12, the House also adopted it by a vote of 62-22. Although the Virginia legislators voted against the federal suffrage amendment, they knew that it would be ratified, and on March 12, a qualifications bill to enable Virginia women to vote, contingent on ratification of the federal amendment, and a resolution to submit to the voters a woman suffrage amendment to the state constitution were adopted by both houses. This action was intended to appear magnanimous, but it appeared only futile. In Virginia, a referendum amendment must pass 2 consecutive legislatures and then be submitted to the voters for their decision before it becomes a law. As only 3 states were then needed to complete ratification, Virginia women would be enfranchised under the federal suffrage amendment long before the Virginia referendum could reach the voters. All the Republican senators in the Virginia legislature voted for ratification, but most of the Democratic senators and members of the lower house ignored the request to ratify that came from the head of their own party, the President of the United States. They publicly declared that as far as they were concerned, their party could go to smash, that democracy could go down, that it makes little difference in Virginia who has control of the government in Washington. They scorned the hundreds of telegrams and letters from their own constituents and the 32,000 state petitioners requesting ratification. As one senator said, they set their minds in defiance of justice and fair dealing. They didn't get the pulse of the times. In Maryland, as in other states, the women had tried for many years to get some form of suffrage from their legislature, but without success. When the federal suffrage amendment was submitted in June of 1920, pressure was at once brought by the Maryland Auxiliary to the National American Women's Suffrage Association to induce Governor Harrington to call a special session, but he advised waiting until the regular session because the legislature had not been elected with the question of the amendment before the people. After the regular session convened January 7, 1920, the Ratification Resolution was introduced in the Senate and sent to the Committee on Federal Relations, while in the House it was sent to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments. A hearing was set for February 11, but when informed that the date was inconvenient for speakers and suffrage leaders who would be in Chicago attending the convention of the National American Women Suffrage Association, the chairman of the Senate committee agreed to postpone the hearing until the 18th. The surprise of the suffragists was therefore great when on February 10, at the reconvening of the session, the chairman of the House Committee on Constitutional Amendments insisted on the hearing for February 11. A canvass of the committee showed a majority in favor of the date being February 18, so the suffragists returned to their homes. Next morning, Baltimore papers announced that the hearing would be held February 11. The suffragists learned that the preceding night the Speaker had transferred the suffrage amendment from the Committee on Constitutional Amendments, which was favorable, to the Committee on Federal Relations, which was hostile. None of the members of the Suffrage Ratification Committee spoke at the hearing. The House Committee refused a hearing. The Senate Committee granted one for February 17. Early that morning, suffragists gathered from all over the state, and at 10:30, led by a band, they marched into the State House. They presented resolutions and petitions representing over 125,000 residents of Maryland. The women made their appeal to Governor Ritchie, successor to Governor Harrington. Answering, he said that the platform of the Democratic Party of the state on which he was elected opposed suffrage, and that he could not ask the legislators to repudiate their platforms. Early in the afternoon, the rejection resolution was reported favorably and carried in both Senate and House. In the House, 33 of the 45 Republicans and 2 of the 56 Democrats, and in the Senate, 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats voted against the rejection resolution. End of Chapter 31, Part 1.
Chapter 31, Part 2 of Woman Suffrage and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Woman Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Shuler. The States that Did Not Ratify. As a visible demonstration of its belief in states' rights on February 24th, the Senate and House voted to send 7 anti-suffrage members to West Virginia to urge that legislature to reject the amendment. The next day, 2 resolutions were introduced in the legislature. One was to repeal, rescind, and recall the resolutions ratifying the so-called 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The other authorized and requested the governor of Maryland to call on the national government in behalf of the state of Maryland to have the so-called 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act declared null and void. On March 30th, by a vote of 20-7, the Senate passed a joint resolution, quote, authorizing and directing the Attorney General of Maryland to bring suit or suits to prevent the Secretary of the United States from proclaiming the federal suffrage amendment prior to the holding of a referendum thereon in certain states, and to test the validity should the same be ratified by the elected legislatures of 3/4 of the states, unquote. In September, just before the legislature adjourned, it was discovered that the resolution of rejection had not been sent officially to the governor of the state and by him to the Secretary of State in Washington. It was brought before both houses again on September 22nd, at which time the ratification resolution was voted down. There was great expectation in Democratic circles that North Carolina would ratify. Democratic leaders emphasized that the Republican states of Connecticut, Vermont, and Delaware having failed, it would be of strategic value if the Democratic Party could get the glory of the 36th ratification. Furthermore, it was maintained that if the North Carolina legislature defeated the suffrage amendment, it would defeat the Democratic candidate for president in November, while if it ratified, it would virtually assure success to the Democratic Party in November. Of all the southern states, North Carolina now presented the greatest hope, not only because of the number of prominent men in federal and state positions in favor of ratification, but because the North Carolina press was almost a unit for it. The Republican State Convention in March had for the first time seated 2 women delegates and had put a woman on the ticket for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. In April, the Democratic State Convention had seated 40 women. United States Senator Simmons and Governor T.W. Bickett, always opponents of suffrage, had announced themselves in favor of ratification. The only discouraging symptom was the attitude of United States Senator Overman, who said, quote, "I have been and still am opposed to woman suffrage. It is fundamental with me, deep and inborn, but I recognize the fact that it seems inevitable." End quote. Could the Democratic Convention, which was held in April of 1920, have dodged the question and deferred action? Undoubtedly it would have. But the Friends of Ratification were there in force. The suffrage plank, as it came from the committee, recommended that the federal suffrage amendment should not be ratified, but that a state amendment should be submitted to the voters. 2 minority reports were offered. One to present to the convention the question whether the platform should contain a plank for ratification, and the other to eliminate all reference to woman suffrage. Men said that never in the history of the Democratic Party in North Carolina had there been such a contest over a platform. Finally, a substitute was presented for all the reports, which read, quote, "This convention recommends to the Democratic members of the General Assembly that at the approaching special session they vote in favor of the ratification of the proposed 19th Amendment to the federal Constitution." Unquote. This was carried 585 to 428. The attention of the whole country thereupon focused on North Carolina, and many people believed that this convention majority, though small, forecast favorable action in the legislature. Early in the summer, in response to an appeal by President Wilson, Governor Bickett had replied in part, quote, "I hope the Tennessee legislature will meet and ratify the amendment and thus make immediate action by North Carolina unnecessary. We have neither the time nor money, and such action on the part of Tennessee would save this state the feeling of bitterness that would surely be engendered by a debate on the subject that would come up in the legislature. I have said all that I intend to say on the subject of ratification. While I will take my medicine, I will never swear that it tastes good, for it doesn't." End quote. The North Carolina political situation was further complicated by an exciting gubernatorial primary. There were 3 candidates in the field for governor. 2 of them opposed ratification, and 1 made defeat of the federal suffrage amendment his chief issue. On August 10th, the legislature met in special session to consider questions of taxation. The enemies of ratification had been busy. On August 11th, a round-robin signed by 63 House members was sent to the General Assembly of Tennessee, which read, quote, "We, the undersigned members of the House of Representatives of the General Assembly of North Carolina, constituting the majority of said body, send greetings to the General Assembly of Tennessee, and assure you that we will not ratify the federal suffrage amendment, interfering with the sovereignty of Tennessee and other states of the Union. We most respectfully request that this measure be not forced upon the people of North Carolina." End quote. The news of this statement as it flashed over the country caused consternation in Democratic ranks. The fact that such action had been taken before the legislature had really organized showed party leaders that a force determined to defeat ratification was at work. The ratificationists decided to make a sudden and decisive coup, and pursuant thereto, on August 13th, the governor appeared before the Joint Assembly. He said in part, quote, "It is well known that I have never been impressed with the wisdom or of the necessity for women's suffrage in North Carolina. But, gentlemen, in the words of Grover Cleveland, a condition, not a theory, confronts us. Women's suffrage is at hand. It is an absolute moral certainty that inside of 6 months some states will open the door and women will enter the political forum. No great movement in all history has ever gone so near the top and then failed to go over. We may just as well realize, gentlemen, that this country is no longer an association of states, but a nation. Whatever a majority of the people of the nation want is going to be the supreme law of the land. I realize more keenly now than ever before that states' rights have passed away. The very most this General Assembly can do is to delay for 6 months a movement it is powerless to defeat. This being true, I am profoundly convinced that it would be the part of wisdom and grace for North Carolina to accept the inevitable and ratify the amendment." End quote. There was pathos in this courageous but reluctant recognition of and capitulation to the new order. It could not have been an easy task to stand before a legislature representing 2.5 millions of North Carolina people and tell them that the political faith handed down by their fathers and grandfathers and treasured by them as fundamental bases of government were but musty relics of bygone days. The governor was severely criticized for asking the Assembly to ratify for party reasons without urging on members the sanctity of convention obligations. Republicans declared that they were obeying the behests of their state and national conventions, even as Democrats should be expected to live up to theirs. The Republicans in Senate and House were resentful. The result of the governor's message was to leave the Democrats unmoved and to incense the Republicans. In the afternoon, news came from Tennessee of the Senate victory, and on the same day the resolution to ratify was introduced in the Senate of North Carolina, referred to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments, and within 15 minutes reported favorably 7-1. Simultaneously, the resolution was introduced in the House and referred to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments. August 17th, amid scenes which had not been witnessed since the days of the Civil War, the North Carolina Senate began consideration of ratification. Great crowds surged through the Capitol, the East Wing being assigned to ratificationists and the West Wing to rejectionists. For 5 hours a heated debate raged, with charges and counter-charges. When agreement to vote was reached, a resolution was unexpectedly made to defer action until the regular meeting of the legislature in 1921, and was carried 25-23. It is quite possible that when this resolution to block immediate action was introduced, it took the friends of suffrage unaware, but it is also true that there were suffrage senators who were glad to make use of any excuse to avoid a vote on the direct issue before the election. The opposition forces planned to bring the ratification up under special order in the lower house in the meantime and dispose of it quickly. "Call it up and kill it right" was the way the anti-suffrage floor leader described it. The ratification resolution was called up in the House on August 18th and defeated. A rejection resolution was immediately reported by the Constitutional Amendment Committee. It was tabled in the House without a dissenting voice. Thus closed the North Carolina chapter on ratification. The attention of Democratic leaders next turned to Louisiana. The women there had early strengthened their position by uniting all organizations under one head, called the Ratification Committee, and there were many favorable assets. All of the newspapers in the state, except 4, advocated the federal suffrage amendment. Martin Byrne, mayor of New Orleans, who had killed the state suffrage amendment in 1918, had not only become converted to woman suffrage, but to ratification. The New Orleans Democratic Association and the State Central Committee were in favor. The opposition centered in New Orleans, where certain elements, mainly the liquor interests, aroused in the campaign of 1918, opposed woman suffrage in any form, and there was other opposition. On reaching Baton Rouge in April, suffragists from the National American Women's Suffrage Association saw women who had worked for suffrage for 25 years and more lined up on the side of the anti-suffragists because of their state's rights belief. On May 10th, the General Assembly convened, and on the 11th, the joint resolution for ratification was presented in both houses, while a state amendment and a bill providing for the payment of poll taxes by the women in case the state amendment became a law were introduced in the House. On May 13th, Governor Pleasant submitted the federal suffrage amendment to both houses with a message of many pages urging the legislature not to ratify it, but instead to submit a state amendment. On the same day arrived 2 anti-suffrage representatives from Maryland. They appealed to Louisiana to join hands with Maryland and kill the federal suffrage amendment, and entered no protest against state suffrage if Louisiana should desire to adopt it. On May 17th, John M. Parker was inaugurated governor. It had been expected by people throughout the country that Governor Parker would be of great assistance in the ratification campaign. As a progressive in 1916, he had been a candidate for Vice President of the United States on a platform that endorsed suffrage by national amendment. In his campaign speeches in the autumn of 1920 while running for governor, Mr. Parker had repeatedly said, "I am for suffrage. It's almost here, and we must have it." Yet there appeared mysteriously, with or without his knowledge, in many parts of the state, copies of his platform containing a states' rights plank, presumably designed to placate those who were opposed to the federal suffrage amendment. This was not known to the women, and they were totally unprepared when shortly after his inauguration he announced that he was going to keep hands off the suffrage fight. It was a matter for the legislature anyway, and even refused to receive a deputation of women from the Louisiana Auxiliary to the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In answer to a telegram from President Wilson urging his interest and influence, he answered that he found a great difference of opinion among the legislators, large numbers opposed to any kind of woman suffrage, and, all being Democrats, any dictation on his part would be unwise. Early in June, a hearing was held in the House chamber. The hour was 8:30 in the evening. One of the suffrage speakers reported to the National Suffrage Association, quote, "I will never face anything more thrilling or more fearsome. I stood on the press platform just below the speaker's desk with the press people sitting all about me, legislators on the floor and on the aisle steps, the president and members of the National Auxiliary in the seats with the legislators or perched on the tops of the desks. They were all over the place where they could be conspicuously seen and heard, especially heard. The audience was terribly near. I could touch the first of them, and way up to the roof was a sea of faces. I could not write my speech beforehand. It had to be born out of the inspiration of the day's events, the occasion, and the other speeches. When I looked at the men, most of them crouching behind an old tradition of state sovereignty and a pitiful make-believe fear of Negro domination, I was filled with such indignation that my speech came tumbling out. I challenged the quality of their democracy and said they voted with their party only because of one issue, the Negro question, but that in everything else they were more spiritually akin to Henry Cabot Lodge and the other Tories. The women raised one great shout, and many of the men joined them. I told them that in the Mississippi Valley on the border of the Great West and out through all the reaches of the Great West itself, no such word was known as the one reiterated over and over again in the legislature of Louisiana and on the streets, and that was the word sovereign, prefixed to the name of their state, that we knew no sovereign states, we knew only the United States, the Union, where more and more the selfish interests of sections were being merged in the common good of all people." End quote. Ex-Governor Pleasant, in his argument against ratification, said, quote, "The South never has stood for the 15th Amendment. It is true that 7 Southern states are recorded as having ratified it, yet it was done by carpetbag rule. It was ratified in these halls with Negroes sitting as legislators and a carpetbag governor in the office below. Ratification of the 19th Amendment not only would give suffrage to the white women, but to the Negro women of the state. If we ratify the 19th Amendment, we ratify the 15th and give suffrage to the Negro men." Unquote. Reviewing these arguments, Mr. Fanor Brazil cried that he did not believe, quote, "that any law can be enacted that will let you, red-blooded as you are, stand by and let the Negro vote. The death knell of forced bills was sounded in '78, and you know it. I know it too, because I was there in my parish with a gun, and the only reason that I was not imprisoned is that a friend furnished me a fast horse, and today there is a federal indictment pending against me up there. I can promise you one thing, and that is that if the federal amendment is ratified, there will be no Negro women voting in the parish of Natchitoches." End quote. That sentence caught the fancy of the crowd. "No, nor in Red River either," roared a deep voice, "nor in Plaquemine, and they won't vote in Sabine, you can bet. Neither anywhere." J.Y. Sanders, United States Congressman, appealing for ratification and answering the Negro argument, said in part, quote, "There ain't but one thing, and you might as well remember it. that keeps Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama white, and that is this, that we have decreed that the palladium of our liberty and the cornerstone of our civilization rests for all time in the white Democratic primary, and that once the primary is over, there is not, nor under God's providence shall there ever be, any general election." End quote. From May 27th to July 8th, Senate and House played football with the ratification, state suffrage, and poll tax resolutions. In the meantime, Champ Clark, former Speaker of the House of Representatives, addressed the General Assembly and urged ratification. In answer to an appeal from members of the National Auxiliary, Homer Cummings wired Mr. Byrne to help on the grounds of party advantage, and James M. Cox, Governor of Ohio, Democratic nominee for President of the United States, wired members of the legislature to act favorably, saying, "The legislature owes such action to the Democratic Party." It was clear from the first that the state amendment was only a subterfuge, and as such it was killed. Ex-Governor Pleasant, its chief sponsor, was reported to have said that he did not care whether it went through or not. All he wanted was to kill ratification. With the resolution to let the voters of the state decide the question of women's suffrage by vote at the polls defeated, the poll tax resolution was withdrawn. The ratification resolution was defeated in the House and action indefinitely postponed in the Senate. The legislature then completed its record before adjourning July 8th by passing the rejection resolution in the House and withdrawing it from the Senate files. The Florida legislature was still in session when the federal suffrage amendment passed Congress, and on June 5, 1919, Sidney J. Katz, governor, sent a message to the legislature pointing out that Florida would be the first state to ratify if it chose. "Move that the governor's message be referred to the Committee on Unfinished Business," yelled a chorus of voices. This was met with loud guffaws of laughter, as that is a committee that never reports. "Suffrage lost by skylarking in the House," read the newspaper headlines next day, and under them was this, quote, "The suffrage amendment resolution would no doubt have passed, as earlier in the session a resolution proposing submission of a state suffrage amendment had carried, but that the spirit of fun had permeated the House and practically killed all business." End quote. The legislature adjourned on June 6 without taking action on the governor's message asking for ratification. The Constitution of Florida regarding ratification of federal amendments reads, quote, "No convention or legislature of this state shall act upon any amendment of the Constitution of the United States proposed by Congress to the several states, unless such convention or legislature shall have been elected after such amendment is submitted." End quote. It was later that this same provision in the Tennessee Constitution was held to be outruled. But even at this time it was known that the legislature of Florida had ratified the federal Prohibition Amendment, though half of the members composing it were elected before the amendment was submitted. To the request of the National Suffrage Association for a special session, the answer of the governor was a most emphatic no, bolstered up with a statement which read, quote, "I have no intention of calling the legislature to consider the woman suffrage amendment. I did my best to pass the same at an extra and a regular session. The legislators were very much opposed, and it would do no good to call them together again for the same purpose." End quote. There was, just the same, a continuation of appeals all through the year. Legislators were interviewed, and no stone was left unturned to secure a session. Florida, as well as Tennessee, was affected by the decision of the United States Supreme Court regarding the Ohio referendum case, and when this decision came in June 1920, and legal obstructions were by it set aside, it was hoped that Florida, where many towns had given municipal suffrage, would break the shackles that bound her to tradition and take her place as one of the ratifying states. But she did not. Florida was the only state in the United States that successfully evaded action. During the last year of the campaign, there hung on the wall at the National Suffrage Headquarters a large map of the United States which recorded the suffrage history of each state by a system of differently colored stars. When the campaign was completed, 38 of the states bore an additional star to show that they had ratified the federal suffrage amendment, while 9 had a black star to show that they had failed to ratify it. Florida had none. These black-starred states were in a row along the Atlantic seaboard from Delaware to Louisiana, the majority constituting the heart of what was once the Southern Confederacy. But was the black record really made in defense of states' rights against federal dictation? Not a bit of it. The proof? It was the South that led the campaign for prohibition by federal amendment. The measure was introduced in the Senate by a member from Texas, and of the 19 Southern senators who voted against the submission of the federal suffrage amendment, 14 voted to submit the federal prohibition amendment. 15 ratifications of the prohibition amendment took place the year following its submission. 11 of them were those of Southern states. Every state that failed to ratify the woman suffrage amendment on the alleged ground of federal interference ratified the federal prohibition amendment. An argument which claims that it is a violation of states' rights for New Jersey, Connecticut, or Rhode Island to ratify woman suffrage and impose it upon South Carolina, Alabama, or Georgia, which rejected it, but that it is no violation of states' rights for Southern states to ratify federal prohibition and impose it upon New Jersey, Connecticut, or Rhode Island, which rejected it, is more ingenious than convincing. To summarize, of the 10 states that did not ratify the federal suffrage amendment, Florida took no action in either house. Georgia's vote was null and void, as Senate and House did not act on a joint resolution. Delaware ratified in the Senate and refused to take action in the House. Mississippi ratified in the Senate and defeated ratification in the House. North Carolina voted to postpone action on the ratification resolution in the Senate and tabled the rejection resolution in the House. South Carolina passed a concurrent instead of a joint rejection resolution, and each House voted on a different measure. Louisiana passed a rejection resolution in the House, but the Senate Journal shows the rejection resolution to have been withdrawn from the Senate files. Maryland discovered just before the legislature adjourned that its rejection of February 17th had not been officially conveyed to the Federal Secretary of State, and on September 22nd voted down a ratification resolution, but did not present the rejection resolution as the federal suffrage amendment had been proclaimed a month before. Alabama and Virginia adopted joint rejection resolutions in both houses. These 2 states, therefore, represented the total tally of states that were actually scored in the rejection program of the anti-suffragists. End of Chapter 31. Read by Sandra.
Chapter 32 of Woman, Suffrage, and Politics. The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Shuler. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Conclusion. We have brought together the evidence that the answer to our question in the foreword to this book is politics. The evidence that it was politics that made America, the cradle of democracy, 27th instead of first on the list of countries democratic enough to extend the right of self-government to both halves of their respective populations. That evidence tends to make clear, too, how slowly men as a whole retreated from the divine right of men to rule over women idea, and how slowly women rose to assume their equal right with men to rule over both. Long after men's reason convinced them that woman suffrage was right and inevitable, the impulse to male supremacy persuaded them that the step would be inexpedient. The lower types of men have always frankly resented any threatened infringement of the rights of the male, and although the higher classes of male intelligence defined the feeling toward woman suffrage in other terms, at source the highest and lowest were actuated by the same traditional instinct. Men believed what they wanted to believe in believing that women did not desire the vote. In 1916, 38,000 women of Maine signed petitions to the electors asking for the vote. But when the question was put to the men voters at the election, only 20,000 responded with aye. In 1917, 1,030,000 women in New York said, over their signatures, that they wanted to vote, but only 703,000 men voted affirmatively on the question at election time. These examples, were there no others, bring into high relief the fact that in the suffrage struggle there were more women who wanted to vote than there were men who were willing to grant them the privilege. Superimposed upon this biological foundation of male resistance to female aggrandizement, was the failure of political leaders to recognize the inescapable logic of woman suffrage in a land professing universal suffrage. On top of this, and as a consequence of it, lay the party inaction which gave opportunity to men who were far from inactive on the suffrage question, because they feared that their personal interests would suffer should the evolution of democracy take its normal course. Had not the Republican Party enfranchised the Negro by whip and bayonet, it would have been easier for women to gain their enfranchisement without party endorsement. But suffragists, left to make their own appeal to majorities accustomed to be told how to vote, found that the lack of political endorsement was as effective as a mandate to vote against. Lax election laws and methods often opened doors for corruption, and by and with the assistance of party officials, suffrage elections were stolen. The damage thus wrought to the woman suffrage cause and the nation's record was far more insidious than the loss of any election would imply. The alleged rejection of suffrage became to the unknowing public an indication of an adverse public sentiment and tended to create rather than correct indifference, for the average man and woman move with the current of popular opinion. The inaction of the public gave a mandate for further political evasion of the question to party leaders, some of whom were certainly cognizant of and others working factors in the criminal schemes which produced the misleading result. Around and around the vicious circle went the suffrage question. "Get another state," said President Roosevelt, excusing national inaction. "Congress has given no indication that it wants women's suffrage," said Governor Pierce of Dakota as he vetoed the territorial bill which would grant suffrage to women. The Congress looked to the states for its cue, the states to Congress, both to the parties and the parties to the various financial interests, which in turn were responsible for the election of a picked list of members of Congress, of legislatures, and of the party leadership. Had more statesmen and fewer politicians directed the policies of parties, women would have been enfranchised in the years between 1865 and 1880, and American history, along many lines, would have changed its course. Party suffrage endorsement was won in the United States after 48 years of unceasing effort, but when the final victory came, women were alternately indignant that it had been so long in coming and amazed that it had come at all. Many men expressed disappointment that women did not at once enter the party campaigns with the same zeal and consecration they had shown in the struggle for the vote. These men forgot that the dominant political parties blocked the normal progress of woman suffrage for half a century. The women remembered. The Republicans found that the Negro fresh from slavery knew too little to play the game of politics. All parties may find in the years to come a still more formidable problem in the woman vote, but for a different reason. If women do not make docile partisans, it will be because, through the long, weary struggle, they have learned to know too much. "Wars are not paid for in wartime, the bills come afterwards," said Franklin, and so it may be said of the cost of political blunders. American women who know the history of their country will always resent the fact that American men chose to enfranchise Negroes fresh from slavery before enfranchising American wives and mothers, and allowed hordes of European immigrants, totally unfamiliar with the traditions and ideals of American government, to be enfranchised in all states after naturalization, and in 15 states without it, and be thus qualified to pass upon the question of the enfranchisement of American women. The knowledge that elections can be controlled and manipulated, that a purchasable vote and men with money and motives to buy can appear upon occasion, that an election may be turned with unerring accuracy by a block of the least understanding voters, that conditions produce many politicians but few statesmen, began long ago to modify for Americans the fine pride in political liberty still the boast upon the 4th of July. That this knowledge should have made conservative types of men and women hesitant to extend the suffrage is not strange, nor is it to be held against conscientious men that they had to struggle with real doubts as to the wisdom of adding women to the electorate. On the other hand, in spite of all weaknesses of the American government, no conscientious man or woman should ever have lost sight of 4 counterfacts. 1. The United States will never go back to government by kings, nobilities, or favored classes. 2. It must go forward to a safe and progressive government by the people. There is no other alternative. 3. Women have had a corrective influence in department after department of society, and the only one pronounced a filthy mire is politics, where they have not been. 4. The problem of leading government by majorities through the mire to the ideal which certainly lies ahead is one which women should share with men. Looking backward, however, it is not resentment at the long scroll of men's biological inhibitions and political blunders unrolled in the suffrage struggle that is, for suffragists, the final picture. The final picture fills with the men and the groups of men, Republican men, Democratic men, with a vision of real democracy luring their souls, who in the political arena fought the good fight for and with suffragists. Their faith in and loyalty to the suffrage cause, their Herculean efforts, their brilliant achievements, their personal sacrifices leap out from the record compellingly, riding down all else. On the outside of politics, women fought one of the strongest, bravest battles recorded in history. But to these men inside politics, some Republicans, some Democrats, and some members of minority parties, the women of the United States owe their enfranchisement. And if we have made here a case for our assertion that American politics was an age-long trap for woman suffrage, we hope that we have not failed to make, as well, a case for these higher-grade American politicians who rescued women's suffrage from that trap and urged it forward to its goal. End of Chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of Woman Suffrage and Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Avai in November 2020. Woman Suffrage and Politics. The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Shuler. Chapter 33. Chronological Record of the Winning of Woman Suffrage by Federal Amendment. Text of the Amendment. Section 1. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2. The Congress shall have power, by appropriate legislation, to enforce the provisions of this article. History of Amendment. First introduced in the Senate, January 10, 1878, by Senator A. Sargent of California. Reported from Committee. In the Senate. 1878. Adverse majority. 1882. Favorable majority, adverse minority. 1884. Favorable majority, adverse minority. 1886. Favorable majority, adverse minority. 1889. Favorable majority, adverse minority. 1890. Without recommendation. 1893. Favorable majority, adverse minority. 1896. Without recommendation. 1913. Favorable majority. 1914. Favorable majority. 1916. Favorable majority. 1917. Unanimously. In the House. 1883. Favorable majority. 1884. Adverse majority. Favorable minority. 1886. Adverse majority. Favorable minority. 1890. Favorable majority. 1894. Adverse majority. 1914. Without recommendation. 1916. Without recommendation. 1917. September 24th. Woman Suffrage Committee created. Yes, 181. No, 107. 1917. December 15th. Reported from Judiciary Committee without recommendation. 1918, January 3rd. Reported favorably from House Suffrage Committee. Voted upon. In the House. January 12, 1915. Yeas 174, nays 204, 378 voting. January 10, 1918. Yeas 274, nays 136, 410 voting. May 21, 1919. Yeas 304, nays 89, 393 voting. In the Senate. January 25, 1887. Yeas 16, nays 34, 50 voting. March 19, 1914. Yeas 35, nays 34, 69 voting. October 1, 1918. Yeas, including pairs, 62, nays 34. February 10, 1919. Yeas, including pairs, 63, nays 33. June 4, 1919. Yeas, including pairs, 66, nays 30. End of Chapter 33. End of Woman Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement by Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Shuler.